All right, settle in, because tonight we are stepping straight into the fog-drenched, soot-blackened, absolutely bewildering world of Victorian childhood. A time when bobbies were considered morally suspicious, children were essentially small adults with worse posture, and the medicine cabinet was one bad afternoon away from being declared a crime scene. If you've ever wondered what it felt like to grow up in a century that confused opium with cough syrup, and believed that fresh air was simultaneously the cure for everything and the cause of everything, then you are in exactly the right place. Before we go any further, take a moment to do the thing. Hit like, subscribe, but only if this is genuinely the kind of content that makes your Monday feel survivable. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and while you're at it, tell me the strangest piece of health advice a grandparent ever gave you. Because I guarantee the Victorians did it first, and louder, and with more confidence than was strictly warranted. Now, turn down the lights. Pull the blanket up a little. Put on something soft in the background, maybe rain, maybe the low hum of a ceiling fan. The Victorians themselves would have recommended 3 wool blankets regardless of the temperature outside, because a chill was always lurking just beyond the window latch, ready to snatch the constitution of any child foolish enough to be caught underdressed after sundown. But let's pause on a few important questions before we begin. Did Victorian children really eat food that was the color of a February sky? Was corporal punishment genuinely considered a form of love? Did the family doctor actually carry leeches in his bag and use them with enthusiasm? Were children truly dosed with morphine-based syrups and then praised for their excellent sleeping habits? Was the wallpaper in the nursery literally poisonous? And is it true that a perfectly respectable Victorian mother might have sent her baby outside in a wire cage attached to the window of a third-floor flat, and considered this not only acceptable but medically advisable? Yes to all of it, yes. Congratulations. You have just woken up in the year 1878, somewhere in the middle of a large, drafty, barely heated English city. You are 7 years old. Your breakfast is the color of wet concrete. Your nanny is already awake and already disappointed in you. And somewhere in this house, someone has hidden the good jam behind a locked cupboard door, and the key is on a ribbon around your mother's wrist, and she is not in a giving mood. Welcome to Victorian childhood. Try to keep your moral fiber intact. Part 1. The nursery, your kingdom, your prison. The first thing you need to understand about being a Victorian child is that you live in a room called the nursery, and the nursery is not, despite what the name might suggest, a warm and gentle place. It is a room that operates according to a set of invisible rules so numerous, so specific, and so deeply arbitrary that you will spend the better part of a decade memorizing them and still regularly get them wrong. You are placed in this room shortly after birth, and you do not leave it with any real permanence until you are deemed old enough to sit at the dinner table without doing something the adults consider embarrassing. This could be anywhere from age 5 to age 12, depending on the severity of your family's opinions about proper behavior and the length of your mother's memory. The nursery itself is a room of contradictions. It is decorated in what adults call cheerful colors, which in the Victorian palette means a sort of faded rose, a crumbling pistachio green, or a deep teal that has seen better days. The wallpaper, which we will address in considerably more alarming detail later, is patterned with flowers or pastoral scenes and is peeling, always slightly peeling, in at least 2 corners. The floor is covered by a rug that maps the history of every meal ever accidentally dropped within these 4 walls. There is a fireplace, but the fire in it is a democratic affair, meaning it burns just warmly enough to make you aware that warmth exists in theory without ever quite delivering it in practice. The furniture has been inherited from somewhere and shows it. The rocking horse has 1 eye. The toy chest sticks when you open it and then refuses to close again. The chair in the corner, the one that is technically yours, has a leg that is slightly shorter than the others, so it rocks gently whenever you sit in it in a way that is not quite rocking horse joyful, but is more like the gentle, queasy motion of a boat in mild weather. Every surface in the nursery is, to some degree, sticky. This is one of the great unsolved mysteries of the Victorian age. No one knows the precise origin of the stickiness. It predates you. It will outlast you. The best working theory is that it is a combination of old porridge, spilled cod liver oil, and whatever substance the previous occupant of this room used to coat the alphabet blocks. You have stopped asking about it. The nursery has rules. Not written rules necessarily, though occasionally someone has pinned a handwritten list to the back of the door in copperplate script that suggests they thought about this very carefully at some point in the recent past. No, the real rules of the nursery are unwritten, passed from nanny to nanny, mother to mother, across generations of households, surviving the shifting fashions of the Victorian era in the way that only truly entrenched domestic law can survive, by never being questioned. Rule the first. Noise is a privilege, not a right, and most days the privilege has been revoked. The nursery is a place of controlled quiet. You may speak at your normal indoor volume, which is to say a volume roughly 2 notches below what you would naturally choose, unless an adult is present, in which case you may speak only when addressed, and even then briefly. Rule the second. Your toys are not for playing with exactly. They are for displaying, for demonstrating competence, and for showing visiting relatives that you have been raised properly. The distinction between playing with a toy and interacting with a toy in a morally upright fashion is subtle but essential. Playing suggests abandon. Interacting suggests character. Rule the third. The nursery window is not to be leaned out of, regardless of what is happening in the street below. The street below, as far as the adults are concerned, is a dangerous and morally compromised place, and any window that faces it should be treated with the same wary respect you would give a known troublemaker. Rule the fourth, and this is perhaps the most important one. Everything in this room, every object, every moment, every small interaction is an opportunity to build character. Your character, specifically, which is apparently not yet sufficiently built, and which requires constant construction every waking hour of every day. The nursery is managed by Nanny. We will spend considerable time on Nanny shortly, because she deserves her own chapter and possibly her own documentary. But for now, understand that she is the absolute sovereign of this small domain, and her authority over you is total, uncontested, and backed by a medicine chest that she alone knows how to unlock. You spend your days in the nursery learning things, playing things within the approved range of play, reciting things, and waiting. A great deal of Victorian childhood is waiting. Waiting to be fed. Waiting to be taken outside. Waiting to be old enough to do something interesting. Waiting for supper. Waiting for the medicine to start working or to stop. Waiting, in some abstract sense, for the whole enormous, bewildering project of childhood to be over so you can finally find out what adults actually get up to. The answer, when it eventually comes, is both disappointing and strangely reassuring. Adults mostly sit in chairs and worry. You have been worrying this whole time without even realizing you were doing it correctly. Part 2. Breakfast. The meal designed to lower your expectations for the rest of the day. Morning in the Victorian household arrives before you are ready for it, as mornings have a way of doing regardless of the century. But in 1878, morning does not come with the slow escalation of an alarm, a few minutes of looking at your phone, and the possibility of a cup of coffee made exactly the way you like it. Morning comes with footsteps on the floorboards, curtains yanked open with decisive force, and the knowledge that somewhere in the kitchen below, your breakfast is being prepared, and it is going to be exactly as bad as it was yesterday. Victorian breakfast for children is an exercise in culinary restraint, so severe it borders on performance art. The centerpiece, the star, the undisputed protagonist of every single morning, is porridge. Or rather, a substance that resembles what porridge might look like if porridge gave up halfway through becoming itself, and decided to remain in a sort of ambiguous transitional state between liquid and solid. The color of this porridge is difficult to describe to a modern audience without resorting to comparisons that seem unkind but are, unfortunately, entirely accurate. It is gray. Not oatmeal gray, which at least carries the warm undertone of something that was recently a grain. This is a gray that suggests the porridge has been sitting long enough to develop its own opinions about being eaten. It is pale. It is thick in some places and disturbingly thin in others, as though it became bored of its own consistency partway through the bowl. You sit at the table. Your hands have been scrubbed clean already because cleanliness is next to godliness, and your mother intends to get as close to both as humanly possible before 8 in the morning. Your siblings are arranged around you in silence because breakfast is not a time for conversation. Breakfast is a time for fortification. You are being fortified. This is what is happening when you eat the gray porridge. You are being made stronger, more resilient, more prepared for whatever the day has in store for you, which, based on previous experience, will involve more porridge, more silence, and at least one lecture. Across the table, your father is reading a newspaper. He has not acknowledged your presence yet. He may not. If the news is particularly interesting or particularly alarming, he might lower the paper just far enough to deliver a sentence about current events that he expects you to receive with the grave thoughtfulness of a small politician rather than the 7-year-old you actually are. The porridge is served by the housekeeper or, in households with fewer staff, by your mother, who places it in front of you with the brisk efficiency of someone completing a necessary task, rather than the gentle encouragement of someone offering you something they hope you'll enjoy. There is no hope involved. Joy is not the point. Sustenance is the point, and sustenance has been achieved. The bowl is in front of you. Eat it. The flavoring situation, or more precisely the non-flavoring situation, requires its own paragraph. Salt exists in the Victorian household, but its allocation to the breakfast porridge is a matter of household politics. Sugar exists as well, but in a quantity and with an accessibility that makes it essentially theoretical. There is a sugar bowl, certainly. It sits on the sideboard. It has a small silver spoon in it. But it is understood, without anyone ever saying so directly, that the sugar bowl is not for you. The sugar bowl is for guests, for occasions, for moments when someone from outside the household needs to be impressed. You are neither a guest nor an occasion. Jam is kept in the pantry behind a door that is, depending on the household, either locked outright or kept at a height that requires the assistance of an adult. This is not an accident. This is a system. Jam is what you get when you have done something sufficiently notable, survived a sufficiently alarming illness, or when your mother is in a mood that she herself would describe as generous and anyone else would describe as merely less strict than usual. On special mornings, something extra arrives. Perhaps a slice of bread, slightly stale, which pairs with the porridge in the same way that silence pairs with more silence, technically harmoniously but without adding much. On the grandest of mornings, a special occasion, a birthday, the day the vicar is coming for lunch, there might be a scrap of cheese on the side. Once, memorably, there was a boiled egg, and the memory of it has since attained the status of family legend. You eat. You do not comment on the texture. You do not push the bowl away. You do not mention that you are fairly sure you spotted something floating in yesterday's breakfast that has now migrated to today's. You eat your gray porridge and you sit up straight and you are grateful, or at least you perform gratitude with sufficient convincingness that no one summons the lecture on ingratitude. After breakfast, you are better prepared for the day, not in any specific way that would be detectable by anyone observing you from outside, but in the Victorian sense, the abstract, theoretical, cannot be measured sense. You are fortified. Your character is being built. The gray porridge is doing its work. Somewhere deep in whatever part of a child is responsible for developing resilience and a high threshold for disappointment. By the time you are excused from the table, you have consumed enough to prevent starvation and little enough to leave plenty of room for ambition. Or at least that is what the adults would say. What you yourself feel is slightly hungry and very much in need of a distraction that is not, under any circumstances, more porridge. Part 3. The Code of Silence, Children as Decorative Furniture. There is a philosophy at the heart of Victorian child-rearing that is stated so often, in so many different homes across the length and breadth of England, that it has achieved the status of a natural law rather than an opinion. Children, it says, should be seen and not heard. It appears on embroidered samplers above the fireplace. It is said at dinner tables with the confident authority of someone citing scripture. It is whispered from one generation of mothers to the next like a secret so old it has forgotten it was ever invented. What it means in practice is this: you are present in this house, but you are present in the way that a well-placed piece of furniture is present. You fill a space. You contribute to the general aesthetic of a well-maintained household. You are visible evidence that your parents have done the reproductive portion of their social obligations. But you do not, under ordinary circumstances, speak. Not unprompted, not at length, not on subjects that no one has specifically invited you to address. The art of existing in a Victorian household without being heard is a skill that takes years to develop, and the learning curve is associated with consequences that are memorable enough to incentivize rapid improvement. You learn to move through rooms like a very small and extremely cautious ghost. Your footsteps, over time, become essentially soundless. You develop an innate awareness of which floorboards creak, memorizing the safe path across every room in the house the way a sailor memorizes a reef. You learn to sit without fidgeting, to breathe without it being conspicuous, and to listen to adult conversations in a way that is indistinguishable from not listening. The drawing room is the most demanding theater for this performance. It is also the most dangerous. There are things in the drawing room that must not be touched, which includes approximately everything in the drawing room. There is a cabinet of china that has been in the family since before anyone currently alive was born. There are side tables with arrangements of objects so precisely positioned that moving any one of them by an inch would be immediately detectable to your mother from across the hall. There is a biscuit tin on the sideboard that represents, for you, one of the great unsolved temptations of your existence. You are allowed in the drawing room. You are permitted to sit in it, attend to it, be displayed in it to visiting relatives and curious neighbors. But you are required in the drawing room to achieve a level of stillness and neutrality that most statues would find challenging. You sit. You fold your hands. You direct your gaze to a middle distance that suggests quiet contemplation rather than desperate longing for the biscuit tin. You do not swing your legs, even though they do not quite reach the floor yet. You do not sigh. You do not drum your fingers. You do not, under any circumstances, make a face. Mealtimes present the most structured arena for the performance of acceptable silence. The dinner table is where the rules are most rigidly enforced, where the consequences for failure are most publicly delivered, and where the contrast between what you want to do and what you are permitted to do is most stark. Adults sit around the table and they talk. They talk about things you do not fully understand, people you have never met, events and places you have never been, political opinions that mean very little to you, except that they seem to make the adults either satisfied or agitated in turns. You sit among them and you listen without listening, and you eat without making noise, and you are, in every measurable sense, invisible. You are not always invisible. Occasionally, your invisibility fails you. A giggle escapes before you can catch it. A comment about something you have observed, something that seems, from your perspective, genuinely interesting or funny or worth sharing, slips out before the internal censor has engaged. This is when you discover that your invisibility has been a grace extended to you, not a right you possess, and its withdrawal is both swift and instructive. The punishments for being heard when you should not have been are creative in their variety and consistent in their effect. There is the reflection chair, a hard-backed seat positioned in the hallway beneath the most severe-looking portrait in the house, where you are directed to sit and think about what you have done until the nature of your error has been thoroughly internalized. There is copying, which involves writing out passages from morally instructive texts until your hand cramps and the lesson in question has been physically engraved into your body, if not your understanding. There is the early bedtime, a punishment that takes something neutral, sleep, and transforms it into a consequence, which is a genuinely impressive piece of parenting philosophy when you think about it. But the most effective deterrent of all is not physical and not even particularly dramatic. It is the look. Victorian adults, particularly Victorian mothers and Victorian nannies, have developed the look into a precision instrument. It is a particular configuration of the face, achieved through what must be years of dedicated practice, that communicates volumes without saying a word. It says, "I have noticed what you have done." I am not going to address it here, in public, in front of everyone, because I am a person of restraint and decorum. But I have noticed, and you should know that I have noticed, and the fact that I am not speaking about it right now does not mean I have forgotten it, and it does not mean it will not come up later, possibly at the least convenient moment imaginable. You become, over time, an extremely skilled reader of the look. You can detect it in its earliest stages, before it has fully formed, and adjust your behavior accordingly. This makes you, by most definitions, a socially perceptive child. The Victorian parents would say it means you have developed appropriate manners. What it actually means is that you have learned to survive in an environment where the consequences of being yourself at full volume are consistent and unpleasant enough to make a quieter version of yourself more appealing. At the end of each day, when you have navigated the dinner table without incident, completed the evening's quiet activities without excess noise, and made it to bed without being summoned for a lecture, you feel a specific kind of satisfaction. It is not the satisfaction of having done something. It is the satisfaction of having successfully not done things, which is, in the Victorian system, just as important, possibly more so. Part 4. Nanny, the woman who runs the nursery and probably the empire. Let us talk about Nanny, because Nanny is, in many ways, the most important figure in your early Victorian life. More present than your father, who appears at mealtimes and in the evening, and whose primary mode of parenting involves the raised eyebrow and the occasional address from behind a newspaper. More hands-on than your mother, who loves you deeply, but expresses this love through the careful management of your schedule, your diet, your wardrobe, and your moral development rather than through any of the warmer, more demonstrable forms of affection that you will only learn about in adulthood when you discover they exist. Nanny is there at the beginning of every day and the end of every day and most of the hours in between. She is the first face you see when you open your eyes in the morning, and the last voice you hear as you drift off at night, usually issuing some final reminder about the importance of lying still and not thinking exciting thoughts before sleep. She is, in the truest sense, the person who raises you, and she approaches this task with the kind of methodical thoroughness that makes other people look like they are merely improvising. Nanny arrives in your life from what seems like a distant and specific place that exists somewhere between professional service and mythological figure. She comes with references, pressed into good behavior by the same hierarchy that produces starched aprons and inflexible timetables. She comes with opinions about child-rearing so firmly held that they have moved beyond opinion into something closer to natural law. She comes with a medicine chest, and the contents of this medicine chest will be discussed in their own section because they deserve it. The physical appearance of Nanny is consistent across households in a way that suggests either a very successful uniform policy or the possibility that all Victorian nannies were manufactured from the same source material. She is dressed in dark colors always. Her hair is up always, secured with a precision that suggests the pins holding it in place have been trained as well as she has. Her apron is white and clean in the morning and various shades of the day's events by evening. She carries keys on a chain at her hip, and the sound of those keys is the primary auditory signal of her approach, giving you approximately 2.5 seconds to stop doing whatever you are doing and arrange yourself into a posture that suggests you have been doing something more appropriate all along. Her schedule is the schedule of the nursery. These are not two separate things. The nursery exists within the schedule that Nanny has established, and to depart from this schedule, for any reason whatsoever, is to introduce a disorder into the household that she finds genuinely distressing in the way that some people find the rearrangement of their bookshelves distressing. The schedule is not cruel. It is thorough. There is a time for waking and a time for washing, and a time for breakfast, and a time for lessons, and a time for outdoor exercise, and a time for further lessons, and a time for what is called free play, but is in practice supervised play with occasional corrections. There is a time for lunch and a time for afternoon rest, and a time for more lessons, and a time for tea and a time for supper, and a time for bathing and prayers in bed. This schedule does not vary significantly between days. It varies slightly for Sundays, when the religious elements are expanded and the play elements are contracted, and it varies for special occasions, when an excitement appropriate to the occasion is permitted within limits, and it does not really vary for anything else. Nanny believes, with the deep, unshakable confidence of someone whose system has been working for decades across multiple households, that the schedule is the foundation of a well-ordered childhood. She is not wrong about this. The schedule does produce a kind of order. Whether it produces the things alongside order, things like joy and curiosity and a willingness to experiment and fail and try again, is a question the Victorian era is not particularly interested in asking. Nanny's relationship with medicine is one of the more alarming aspects of her otherwise orderly reign. The medicine chest is her domain, and she treats it with the same proprietary authority she extends to everything else within her sphere. You do not open the medicine chest. You do not investigate its contents. You do not accept anything from the medicine chest that is not offered to you by Nanny herself, with the solemn authority of someone dispensing something important. The things in the medicine chest are, by any modern standard, astonishing. There are syrups whose main active ingredients are things that currently require a prescription at minimum and are banned entirely at maximum. There are powders that promise a variety of outcomes ranging from calmness to invigorated digestion to a general improvement in moral temperament. There are ointments and poultices and drops and drafts and tonics with names that suggest the manufacturer had a high regard for their own product and a low regard for consumer skepticism. All of these things are dispensed by Nanny at her discretion, based on a diagnostic process that involves looking at you, considering the situation, and arriving at a conclusion about what you require. The conclusion frequently involves something that will make you sleep for longer than seems strictly necessary. Despite all of this, or perhaps because of all of this, you develop for Nanny a complicated affection that will take you years and the perspective of adulthood to fully understand. She is strict in a way that is consistent, which is to say her strictness is not arbitrary or mood-dependent, but is the expression of a genuine set of values that she holds about what children need and how they should be raised. She tells you the same things every day not because she has forgotten she told you yesterday, but because she believes repetition is how children learn. She corrects the same mistakes with the same expressions of resignation not because she is performing disappointment, but because she actually is slightly disappointed and she would like you to do better. And she believes, with a faith that is almost touching, that eventually you will. When Nanny tells you a story in the evening, it is always a story with a point, a moral, a lesson encoded in the narrative that she expects you to extract and retain. The story is never just a story, but on the occasions when she softens slightly, when the day has gone reasonably well and she has not had cause to summon any of the more severe elements of her disciplinary repertoire, there is something in the telling that is almost affectionate. A small warmth like the fire in the grate, not large enough to heat the room properly but unmistakably present, and on cold nights, better than nothing. You will not fully appreciate Nanny until you are grown and you find yourself in a situation that requires you to make a decision under pressure with imperfect information and limited resources, and you realize you know exactly what to do, and you know it because Nanny told you every day until it became part of how you think. This is not a comfortable thing to realize, but it is, in its way, a gift. Part 5, Bath Night, a weekly encounter with questionable hygiene. Once a week, without fail, without mercy, and with a ceremony that suggests the household has been preparing for this moment all the other 6 days of the week, it is Bath Night. Bath Night occupies a very specific position in the emotional landscape of Victorian childhood. It is anticipated with dread, endured with stoicism, and survived with relief. It is the one occasion in the week where your body's relationship with water is addressed in any comprehensive way, and the experience of this occasion is enough to make you understand why the rest of the week proceeds without it. The preparation for Bath Night begins in the kitchen, where water is heated in kettles and pots and carried, with considerable effort and the occasional scalded finger, to wherever in the house the bathing is to occur. In households with the resources for a proper bathroom, this is the bathroom. In households without, and there are many, this is the kitchen itself, or a room adjacent to it, where a tin bath is placed on the floor with the straightforwardness of something that knows exactly what it is and makes no pretense about being anything more comfortable. The tin bath is not large. This is a fact. The tin bath has been purchased to accommodate bodies of various sizes, all of which are larger than the children who will be using it first. This means you fit, but you fit in the way that a letter fits in an envelope when the envelope is slightly too small, technically contained, but without much room for dignity or movement. The order of bathing is a subject of intense domestic negotiation. First in the bath gets the water at its hottest and cleanest, which is a significant advantage. Last in the bath gets water that has been through the rest of the family first and has acquired, in the process, a temperature and color that suggest it should perhaps be starting a new life as something other than bath water. This is what Victorian domestic economies require, and Victorian children are instructed to accept it with gratitude on the grounds that water is water, and character is not built by being selective about the specific water one is washed in. The soap is carbolic. If you are unfamiliar with carbolic soap, the experience can be described as follows. Imagine a bar of soap designed not by someone who wanted bathing to be pleasant, but by someone who wanted it to be thorough. It is serious soap. It has strong opinions. It approaches its work with an aggression that suggests it has a personal score to settle with every square inch of your skin, and it leaves you feeling less clean in a refreshing way and more clean in the way that a surface is clean after being scoured. Nanny applies it with the efficiency of someone who has done this many times and has never once been persuaded that gentleness was required. Hair washing is not a regular feature of Bath Night. Hair washing is reserved for occasions, which is the Victorian term for an event significant enough to justify the additional effort involved. These occasions include significant social visits, certain religious holidays, and outbreaks of the kinds of things that live in hair, and that nobody discusses by name in polite company, but that everybody knows about and has experienced. On hair washing nights, the process involves a jug of water, various substances meant to address whatever the current occupant of the hair situation is, and a level of vigorous attention that leaves your scalp both cleaner and considerably sorer than it was before. After the washing, you are dried with a towel that is, whatever its other virtues, not large, not thick, and not, strictly speaking, fully dry. Victorian towels exist in a permanent state of almost dry, as though the concept of dryness is something they are working toward but have not yet achieved. They smell of the cupboard they live in, which smells of lavender water and something underneath the lavender water that suggests the lavender is covering for something. You are rubbed down efficiently, dressed in a nightshirt and inspected. The inspection is the part of Bath Night that most clearly reveals what Bath Night is actually for, which is not comfort or pleasure but verification. Nanny examines you for anything that requires attention. New rashes, new scratches, spots, marks, any evidence of things that should not be there or things that should be there and are not. Anything that passes inspection is fine. Anything that does not pass inspection is addressed using the contents of the medicine chest, which involves ointments of various purposes and degrees of unpleasantness, all applied with a confident authority that suggests Nanny knows exactly what each of them is for, even if the labels are in a script too small and too old-fashioned to read from any useful distance. The real upside of bath night, the thing that makes it bearable, is proximity. Everyone goes through the same process. The kitchen is warmer than the rest of the house because of the kettles. Your siblings are nearby, going through the same indignities in sequence. There is a kind of solidarity and shared discomfort that the Victorian domestic schedule does not often provide, and bath night is one of its rare expressions. In the moments between your bath and your siblings, while the water is being topped up or cooled down, you sit together in various states of damp, and you talk in a way that you are not usually permitted to talk, quietly, quickly, without the formal architecture of the dinner table or the nursery lesson. It is one of the more purely companionable moments of the week. You emerge from bath night technically cleaner than you went in, though not, it must be said, in the way that people in later centuries will come to expect. You are clean enough. You are clean in the Victorian sense, which is to say that the primary evidence of the day's activities has been removed and a more acceptable baseline has been restored. Tomorrow, the process of becoming a child in the world will begin again, and in 6 days' time, the bath will address whatever accumulates in between. This is fine. This is normal. This is how it is. In the Victorian world, cleanliness is a weekly aspiration rather than a daily achievement, and the aspiration itself, the willingness to submit to the tin bath and the carbolic soap and the not quite dry towel, is considered evidence of moral seriousness. You are taking it seriously. This is what matters. Part 6. The Toy Chest, TRESURES, TERRORS, and Tetanus. At the center of the nursery, or more precisely in the corner where it has been positioned to keep it away from the fire and the window and any other surface that might cause it harm, is the toy chest. The toy chest is the most important object in your world, and you have complicated feelings about it. It contains, depending on the generosity of your family and the occasion, a selection of objects that range from genuinely delightful to inexplicably alarming, with a significant portion of the middle ground occupied by things that are both at once. Victorian toys are built for survival rather than safety. This is not a criticism but an observation, a fair characterization of an approach to toy design that prioritizes durability and craftsmanship over the comfort of the small person interacting with it. Your toys are made of wood, metal, china, bone, ivory, painted cloth, and various combinations of these materials in ways that produce objects capable of surviving the rough treatment of children across several generations. They are not soft. They do not have rounded edges out of any particular concern for your well-being. They are not, in the sense that later centuries will develop the concept, safe. The wooden toys are the foundation, blocks for building, animals for populating imaginary landscapes, soldiers for staging small battles with the gravity that tiny military operations deserve. They are painted in bright colors, or were bright once, before the paint began its slow retreat into chipped memory. You should not chew on these toys. You will chew on them anyway because you are a child, and children in the Victorian era have the same oral relationship with the world as children in all other eras. The lead-based paint, cheerfully applied, will not kill you. It will not kill you in the way that many things in the Victorian nursery will not kill you. Narrowly, contingently, through a combination of luck and whatever constitutional robustness your diet of gray porridge is providing. The dolls are their own category of experience. A Victorian doll is not a soft, squishy companion designed to be comforting. A Victorian doll is a porcelain or bisque artifact with hand-painted features, glass eyes, and an expression that has been described by children across the entire span of the Victorian era as knowing. The eyes are too realistic to be comforting and too still to be natural. They follow you in the way that the eyes of certain portraits follow you, with the specific quality of something that is watching without watching, attending without attending. Your doll has real hair. This is true of the better dolls, and it is intended to be a mark of quality and realism. In practice, the knowledge that the hair on your doll's head once grew out of a real human head raises a number of questions that you are not quite old enough to formulate fully but old enough to find unsettling. You keep the doll because it is yours and because it is a good doll by any objective measure, but you keep it at the far end of the shelf rather than next to your bed, just in case. The Jack-in-the-Box is a Victorian institution that deserves special consideration. It is a box with a crank on the side, and you crank the crank and it plays a tune. And at a point in the tune that you have now memorized but that somehow still manages to startle you every single time, the lid of the box springs open and something pops out. The something varies. In the better Jack-in-the-Boxes, it is a cheerfully painted figure in a pointed hat. In yours, it is a figure with a grin that is slightly too wide for the face it occupies and eyes that are slightly too large for the face it occupies, and it springs upward on a spring that has apparently been coiled by someone with strong opinions about the importance of impact. It has startled you, reliably, every day for 2 years. It will probably startle you for the rest of your life. You have shown it to younger children who were not expecting it, in an attempt to reclaim some of the power it has over you by becoming the person who deploys it rather than the person it deploys against. The rocking horse stands in the corner and commands the room in the way that things which are large, wooden, and moderately unpredictable tend to command rooms. It is painted in what was once a dappled gray, and is now a dappled gray that has been applied over a previous color of dappled gray, suggesting this horse has been repainted several times by several children who felt that its appearance required improvement. One of the ears is damaged. The saddle, technically leather, is cracked in several places and has a rough edge that you have learned to avoid by sitting slightly to the left. The eyes are glass, and they look at you with an expression that is not quite the doleful expression of the doll's, but that has its own quality, something between vacancy and intent. You ride it anyway. You ride it because it is the best thing in the nursery for approximating the feeling of going somewhere without actually going anywhere, which is, some days, exactly what you need. Part 7. The Window Cage Fresh Air Victorian Style. There exists, in the canon of Victorian parenting decisions, a moment that represents the era's approach to child welfare in its purest and most concentrated form. That moment is the baby cage, the window cage. The wire contraption attached to the exterior of an apartment window, 2 or 3 or 4 floors above the pavement, into which a Victorian parent, on the advice of Victorian medical literature, would place their infant and leave them there, in the open air, for some period of time measured in what can charitably be described as however long seemed appropriate. To understand the baby cage, you have to understand the Victorian relationship with fresh air, which is a relationship of profound and contradictory devotion. The Victorians believed, with the certainty of people who have based their certainties on a combination of genuine observation and creative extrapolation, that fresh air was one of the most essential ingredients in the recipe for a healthy child. Stale air, warm indoor air, air that had been breathed by too many people for too long in an enclosed space, was considered dangerous. It produced miasmas. It encouraged illness. It weakened the constitution. A child raised in insufficiently aired rooms was a child who was being, in a measurable sense, cheated by their parents. The solution to this problem, in a city like London or Manchester or Birmingham, where the air directly outside the window of your lodgings is not the crisp mountain air of a health pamphlet, but the industrialized, coal-flavored, occasionally aromatic product of a Victorian city operating at full capacity, was the baby cage. You solve the problem of insufficient fresh air by creating a device that allows the fresh air to reach the baby. The baby cannot come to the fresh air without the supervision required for a child too young to be trusted in the street. The fresh air cannot penetrate the building to any useful degree. Therefore, the cage. If you are the baby in question, your experience of the window cage begins with the confusing transition from warm indoors to the sensory complexity of the exterior. You are bundled first, extensively, in the Victorian tradition of bundling that treats the human infant as something that must be wrapped to an almost geological degree before being considered adequately protected. Wool, muslin, more wool. A bonnet secured in a way that suggests it is expected to remain in place through conditions more severe than a Tuesday morning on a London side street. Then, bundled and bonneted and swaddled into a shape that resembles a very small and very well-wrapped package, you are carried to the window and inserted into the cage. The cage is wire, roughly constructed in a shape that accommodates your bundled form with room enough to be turned occasionally. The window is opened. The latch on the cage is secured. And there you are on the outside of the building, suspended above whatever is passing below. What passes below in a Victorian city street is considerable. Horses and their associated outputs, carts, people of various purposes and levels of hurry, chimney sweeps, vendors, children from less medically progressive households, moving under their own power at street level and observing the baby in the cage with the philosophical acceptance of city children who have seen more unusual things before breakfast. Pigeons, with the particular pigeon quality of treating every surface as equally available for their purposes. The general noise and smell of a city that has not yet discovered either the internal combustion engine or meaningful sanitation reform. You are in the cage getting your fresh air. The fact that the fresh air in question has passed through a coal fire on its way to you is not considered relevant by the adults who put you there. Air from outside is better than air from inside. This is the principle. The principle is being applied. The medical and parenting literature of the era endorses this practice with a confidence that is, in retrospect, quite something. Doctors write about the benefits of outdoor exposure for infants with the same relaxed authority with which they write about everything else, which is to say without what later generations would call evidence, but with the full force of their professional opinion, which in the Victorian era is essentially the same thing. Mothers read these articles in the penny papers and the ladies' magazines, and they implement the advice because the Victorian relationship between parents and professional medical authority is one of comprehensive deference. The doctor has said it. The magazine has confirmed it. The cage is attached to the window. Into the cage goes the baby. The cage holds. This is worth noting because the cages, being constructed from materials and by craftsmen whose primary market is not safety-tested infant products, vary in quality. Most hold. Most mornings the baby is retrieved without incident, brought inside, unwrapped from their excessive bundling, and found to be pink-cheeked and possibly better for the experience, or at least no worse, which in the Victorian accounting of child welfare is close enough to the same thing. Occasionally, a faulty latch or an unexpected gust causes a moment of excitement that is described in the family history as an adventure, and in the mother's private correspondence as something she would prefer not to think about. In the family photograph, taken years later when you are old enough to understand what you are looking at, there is sometimes a picture, blurred sepia, taken from inside the room looking out. A small bundled shape in a wire cage outside a window with the street or the building opposite visible behind. The caption in careful script, "Our little one, airing, summer 1882." Part 8, Discipline, the rod, the look, and the lecture. Victorian discipline is, by the standards of any era after it, a bracing topic. It is also a complex one, because Victorian attitudes toward the disciplining of children are neither uniform across the era, nor simple in their reasoning, nor entirely without affection in their intent. The Victorians who disciplined their children the most firmly, the ones who reached for the wooden spoon or the cane with the quickest reflexes, generally did so out of a genuine belief that they were doing right by the child in question. This does not make it better, but it helps explain why the era produced what it produced. At the heart of Victorian discipline is a theological conviction that has practical consequences. Children are born in a state of natural wildness that must be shaped, controlled, and directed toward virtue by the consistent application of external authority. The child left to itself, to its own impulses and preferences and inclinations, will not naturally tend toward virtue. It will tend toward disorder, idleness, noise, and the kinds of behaviors that the Victorians associate with the uncultivated and the morally undirected. The parent's job, therefore, is to apply direction, consistently, firmly, and if necessary with whatever physical reinforcement the situation requires. The tools of this direction are many. The wooden spoon is the most commonly referenced, and for good reason. It is large enough to serve as a meaningful deterrent, light enough to be wielded without significant effort, and present in every kitchen, in every household, in every class in England, which means there is never a shortage. It is applied in the traditional deployment to the hand or the seat of the trousers, with a force calibrated to the severity of the offense. A minor offense produces a minor application. A major offense produces the kind of application that is remembered. The cane belongs to the more formal end of the disciplinary spectrum. It is associated with schools and with fathers of a certain type, with households where discipline is a matter of serious principle rather than domestic management. It is also associated, in certain households, with a level of ceremony that is its own form of instruction. The child knows the cane is coming, is told to wait for it, experiences the anticipation of it as an additional element of the consequence. But the most distinctively Victorian instruments of discipline are not physical at all. They are psychological, and they are, in their way, more lasting than anything that leaves a mark you can see. The look, which we have discussed in the context of the drawing room, is one. But there is also the lecture, which is perhaps the defining disciplinary technology of the era, and the thing that, above all others, explains the particularly Victorian relationship between adults and children. The lecture is a form of verbal discipline that achieves its effect not through volume, nor through anger, nor through any of the more dramatic emotional displays that later generations might recognize as parental upset. The lecture is delivered calmly. It is delivered at length. It is delivered with the rational patience of someone who has thought carefully about the ethical principles involved, and is now explaining them to you with the thoroughness of a person who intends to be understood. It is delivered at a time when you are required to stand still and listen to it in its entirety, without fidgeting, without expression, without any of the defensive mechanisms that the child in you would very much like to employ. The lecture about any given offense is not about the offense itself. That is to say, if you have done something wrong, the lecture will address the offense briefly, but will spend most of its considerable length on the larger context of the offense. What kind of person does this sort of thing? What the consequences of this sort of behavior are for the person who indulges in it across the span of a lifetime? What your grandfather would have thought if he could see you now? And what the relationship is between this particular failing and the broader project of moral development that your parents are engaged in on your behalf, against considerable odds. You listen. You stand still. You maintain the neutral expression. You do not fidget. Inside, you are doing whatever children do inside during lectures that are too long and too earnest to engage with directly, but that you cannot simply ignore because you are standing in front of the person delivering them with nowhere else to go. The remarkable thing, the thing that takes years to appreciate, is that some of it goes in. Not all of it, and not in the way the lecturer intends, and not in a way that is available to you immediately. But some of it becomes part of how you understand the world, turns up later as an instinct or an inclination or a sense of what is, and is not done in certain situations. and you recognize it as a lecture, and you feel about this recognition, the specific complicated feeling of someone discovering that their prison had a door they didn't notice until they were already on the other side of it. Part 9. SWETS, the precious, the rare, the dental catastrophe. Let's talk about sugar. Or more precisely, let's talk about the near-total absence of it from the daily life of a Victorian child, and what this scarcity does to the significance of every single occasion on which it is not absent. Because in the Victorian household, sugar is not a pantry staple. It is not a thing that exists in unlimited quantities in a cupboard you can access without asking. It is not on the table at breakfast or available as a casual addition to hot drinks. Sugar in the Victorian childhood is a controlled substance, rationed, monitored, deployed strategically, and experienced, when it arrives, with an intensity of appreciation that people in sugar-saturated later centuries simply cannot replicate. The sweet tin, when it appears, is an event, not the casual appearance of a bag of something purchased for no particular reason on the way home, but an actual event with context and significance, and the particular emotional texture that scarcity gives to things. Sweet tins appear on birthdays. They appear on the days when someone in the house is celebrating something worth celebrating. They appear on holidays, particularly Christmas, where the orange in the stocking is its own thing, and the occasional appearance of actual candy is treated as an abundance verging on excess. They appear when a visitor brings something for the children, which is to say for the small, quiet people who have been producing their best behavior in the background of this visit, and who are now being rewarded with a quantity of something sweet that a later generation would find insulting in its smallness, but that you, in your context, receive with genuine joy. The distribution of sweets, when they appear, is its own ritual. Your mother or nanny or whoever has custody of the tin on this occasion hands them out with a solemnity that is not performed but genuinely felt, because the sweets represent something that goes beyond confectionery. They represent a moment of loosening, a brief yielding of the normal principles of scarcity and restraint, a small acknowledgement that the business of childhood is not supposed to be unrelenting. 1 sweet each. Not 2, except on exceptional occasions. 1 each, to be held in the hand and looked at for a moment before it goes in the mouth, and then to be managed with whatever strategy each child has developed for getting the maximum possible duration out of a single piece of hard candy. The sweets themselves are, by any later standard, fairly simple things. Barley sugars, hard and clear, pulled into their twisted shape by someone who has done this many times before. Pear drops, with their particular sharp sweetness that arrives in one note and stays in that note. Lemon drops. Humbugs. The occasional and much prized piece of toffee, which offers the additional satisfaction of requiring effort. You must work for the toffee, and the working makes the eating feel earned. Chocolate is available, but is a different category of experience. Victorian chocolate is not the smooth, creamy product that later technology will produce. It is grittier, more bitter, less certain of its own identity than it will eventually become. But it is chocolate, and its appearance in the household carries with it an aura of the exotic and the expensive that makes every piece significant. A small square of chocolate on a Thursday afternoon is not a casual thing. It is a small, significant, thoroughly appreciated thing, and the child who receives it is doing so in full awareness of exactly how unusual this is. The dentistry situation, which is the inevitable consequence of discussing Victorian sweets, requires acknowledgement here because it is the shadow that falls across every piece of candy and every stolen lick of a sweet wrapper. Victorian dental care is not, to put it generously, what it will become. The family dentist, in households that have access to one, practices a form of dentistry that is as much about courage as it is about technique. If you have a toothache, the first line of response involves cloves and hope. If the cloves and hope fail, which they generally do, the response escalates. The escalation involves a practitioner who is very confident, equipped with implements that are very direct, and committed to a philosophy of treatment that is primarily extractive rather than restorative. You lose the tooth. In a Victorian dental context, losing the tooth is often the best available outcome. This dental reality is not, remarkably, something that significantly diminishes the appeal of sweets in the Victorian child's life. The connection between sweet things and dental consequences exists in the Victorian understanding of health and diet, but it occupies the same cognitive space as most other Victorian health knowledge, which is to say it is true in theory while being regularly overridden in practice by the sheer power of wanting the sweet thing that is, for once, actually available. Part 10. The Schoolroom Memorize, Recite, Don't Embarrass the Family. Education in Victorian England occupies a very specific position in the culture's hierarchy of values. It is important. It is tremendously important. It is the thing that separates the educated from the uneducated, the capable from the incapable, the person who will have opportunities from the person who will not. But the Victorian understanding of what education is and does is different, sometimes very different from what later centuries will develop, and the experience of receiving it is something that requires explanation if you are going to understand it from the inside. The primary method of Victorian education is memorization. This is not a secondary feature of the system or an element that some schools use and others don't. Memorization is the central technology. You are given things to memorize. You memorize them. You are asked to produce them on demand. If you can produce them correctly, you have demonstrated learning. If you cannot, you have not yet demonstrated it, and further effort is required. This is the system in its entirety. What you memorize covers an enormous range. The multiplication tables, forward and backward, which is to say backward not in some metaphorical sense, but literally in reverse order from 12 times 12 to 1 times 1, because this is considered both useful and demanding, and Victorian education values demands. Passages of verse, particularly verse with moral content, because verse with moral content is both educational in the knowledge sense and instructive in the character sense, providing two benefits for the effort of one. The kings and queens of England, their dates, their significant acts, the ordering of their reigns, all in sequence, all available for immediate retrieval. Geographical facts about the empire. The names of rivers and mountain ranges and significant cities in places that are colored pink on the classroom map for reasons that are explained as natural and are in retrospect considerably less natural than they are made to sound. Latin is the crowning achievement of Victorian educational ambition, and the Victorian child's relationship with Latin is one of the most consistently described features of the era's educational writing. Latin is hard. Latin is harder than anything you have previously encountered. Latin has declined in 5 ways for 3 genders, and the arrangement of these declines into tables that must be memorized, and then applied correctly to sentences that were composed by people who lived 2,000 years ago and were not, it is clear, thinking about whether a Victorian child would find them accessible. The teachers who administer this education are a type. They are not cruel, as a general rule, or not intentionally so, but they are committed to the principle that difficulty is itself educational, that the child who finds a subject hard and continues anyway is learning something more important than the subject, and this principle leads them, quite consistently, to calibrate the difficulty upward rather than downward when a child is struggling. If you cannot do the thing that is required, the response is not to make the thing easier. The response is to require you to do it more times, under more pressure, until either the thing becomes possible through repetition, or you develop the kind of relationship with failure that the Victorians consider an important character-forming experience. The physical environment of the schoolroom is consistent across the era. Cold in winter, stuffy in summer, lit by whatever combination of windows and candles or gas lamps are available, furnished with desks that have been used by children for long enough that the wood is marked with the evidence of previous occupants. Initials, diagrams, Small, desperate carvings that might have been intended as drawings, or might have been the overflow of energy in a body that was required to sit still for much too long. The ink pots leak. The chalk breaks. The books have been in use long enough that the pages are soft at the corners from the thumbs of children who came before you. The classroom has a blackboard. The blackboard is the teacher's primary communication technology, and they use it with the authority of someone who controls access to essential information. Things written on the blackboard are authoritative. Things not written on the blackboard may or may not be important, but things written on it definitely are. You copy things from the blackboard into your exercise book with whatever combination of accuracy and neatness you can manage, knowing that the neatness will be evaluated and that the accuracy is assumed. Lunches are brief affairs, eaten quickly, without ceremony, in whatever space is available. The food is unremarkable, not in the gray porridge way of the morning meal, but in the general way of food that has not been prepared with particular interest in how it will be received. You eat it because it is there, and because the next meal is several hours away, and childhood on the Victorian diet requires strategic fueling wherever it is offered. At the end of the school day, you emerge with ink on your fingers that is currently indelible, and a head full of information in varying states of retention. Some of it will remain. The multiplication tables and the kings and queens will stay, lodged in some part of the memory that Victorian education seems to have identified and occupied for the long term. Other things will fade. The Latin will retreat to something you know you once knew. The geography will become a general impression of a world that was organized differently than it is now. But the experience itself, the hours of sitting, the discipline of attention, the practice of producing what is required when it is required, will stay in you in ways that are harder to name but possibly more durable than any of the specific content. Part 11. The Medicine Cabinet, Pharmacology for the Brave and the Trusting. The Victorian Family Medicine Cabinet is one of the more instructive artifacts of the era, because it tells you, in the specific language of what substances people chose to keep at home for the health of their children, exactly what the Victorian era understood about the relationship between medicine and well-being. Which is to say, it understood some things very well, and other things in ways that required significant revision in the decades that followed. The contents of the medicine cabinet are impressive in their range. There are things in there that would be recognized today, substances that have survived the long journey from Victorian home remedy to modern approved medicine essentially intact. And there are other things that will be recalled with the kind of startled recognition that comes from realizing that the thing being described was what someone gave to children as a matter of routine, and that the children survived it, which is either a testament to the resilience of children or to the relatively small doses involved, or to something that remains medically unexplained. Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup is perhaps the most famous entry in this catalog, and deserves a moment of dedicated attention. It was produced, sold, and enthusiastically recommended throughout the Victorian era as a solution for the difficulties of infancy, specifically teething, and specifically the crying that accompanied teething, and that Victorian parents, like all parents in all centuries, found both distressing and exhausting. The syrup was widely available. It was affordable. It was reviewed positively in the domestic press. Mothers passed the recommendation from one to another with the evangelical confidence of people who have found something that genuinely works. It worked because it contained morphine, not in the metaphorical sense in which Victorian medicines were sometimes described as powerful, but in the literal sense. Morphine, which is what it is called, was present in the syrup in quantities sufficient to produce, in an infant, the sleeping that the label promised. The baby that was dosed with Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup did, in fact, become soothed. The soothing was the soothing of an opioid sedative applied to an undeveloped nervous system, but from the perspective of the parent observing the result, the soothing was the same soothing that the label said would happen, so the product was a success. This was not unusual. The era's most popular children's medicines, the ones with the widest distribution and the most enthusiastic customer base, were generally effective precisely because they contained substances that would, in later centuries, require either a prescription or a lawyer. Laudanum, which is opium dissolved in alcohol, was available over the counter and was recommended for a range of complaints from insomnia to anxiety to general fussiness. Teething powders contained traces of mercury. Cough syrups contained alcohol. Various tonics and invigorating preparations contained stimulants of sufficient strength that, taking them as directed, would today put you in a very different kind of medical conversation than the one they were intended to prompt. The adults administering these things did so in good faith. Victorian medicine operated with the tools available to it, which included a genuine understanding of chemistry, but not a complete understanding of pharmacology, and a genuine desire to help children who were suffering, but not a complete map of what exactly the helping was doing. The doctors who endorsed these products were not charlatans, or not all of them. Some of them were physicians of genuine skill and commitment who wrote carefully and thought seriously about their recommendations, and who simply did not have available to them the clinical trial methodology that would later become the standard for establishing what medicine actually does. Beyond the famous inebriants, the medicine cabinet also contained a range of things that were merely ineffective rather than problematic. Poultices made of mustard plasters that produced impressive sensations without reliably producing cures, garlic preparations that addressed odor more effectively than illness, herbal preparations whose main active ingredient was the hot water used to make them, and various ointments with names like universal salve and healing preparation that promised broadly and delivered narrowly. The treatment of cuts and wounds is its own category. The Victorian household's approach to a cut was direct: clean it, cover it, apply something. The something was often iodine, which stings in a very honest way that communicates that it is doing something even if what it is doing is primarily causing you to sit very still and breathe carefully. Or carbolic acid, in diluted form, which had genuine antiseptic properties, and was applied with the same calibrated roughness as everything else in the Victorian medical repertoire. Doctors who visited the house added their own contributions to the therapeutic landscape. The doctor's black bag contained its own array of Victorian certainties, including, in earlier decades of the era, leeches. The therapeutic use of leeches is one of the more enduring legacies of pre-modern medicine, and the Victorians inherited it from centuries of practice and deployed it with a confidence that declined across the era but never quite reached zero. If you were bled by leeches as a child, you were having something done to you that doctors genuinely believed would help, applied by a person with professional training and serious intent, in service of a theory of illness that was wrong in ways that took decades to fully establish. You survived. This is the summary of Victorian medicine as experienced from the inside. You took the syrups and the powders and the ointments and the drafts, and you wore the poultices, and you submitted to the inspections, and you were dosed and examined and treated with the full confidence of a medical profession that was doing its absolute best with what it had. And you survived, not because of all of this exactly, but not entirely in spite of it either. The human body, it turns out, is more robust than Victorian parents feared, and more resilient than Victorian medicine required. Part 12. The Sibling Parliament Alliances BTRAYLS and Stolen BISUATS. The siblings. The other people who share the nursery with you, who eat from the same table, who are subjected to the same rules, the same schedule, the same gray porridge, the same bath water in succession, and who represent, as a result, both your closest allies and your most immediate and persistent competition. Victorian childhood is generally a childhood lived in close proximity to siblings, and this proximity produces relationships of a specific and lasting intensity that adult relationships rarely achieve, because adult relationships rarely involve sharing a room, a nanny, a limited supply of treats, and a single rocking horse with a damaged ear. The hierarchy among siblings is established early and adheres to a simple principle: age is authority. The eldest child has seniority over the younger ones, and this seniority is real in the sense that it comes with privileges, and also real in the sense that it comes with responsibilities, and also not as simple as it sounds, because the eldest child is also the one whose mistakes are most publicly noticed, and whose standard of behavior sets the expectation against which all subsequent children are measured. Being eldest has advantages. It also has the specific disadvantage of going first into everything new and unknown, from schools to social situations to the realization of things about the world that the younger ones get to discover with the benefit of having watched someone else discover them first. The youngest child occupies the opposite position, with the advantages and disadvantages appropriately reversed. The youngest is last into everything, benefits from the precedents established by the older ones, and is generally treated with a degree of latitude that the older siblings observe with a resentment that is entirely justified and entirely futile. The youngest also has no one younger to be in charge of, which means that the project of self-determination is entirely dependent on what the older ones allow, which is contingent entirely on what the older ones feel like allowing on any given day. The middle children, however many there are, navigate an existence between these two poles, with the freedom of not being first and the challenge of not being last, and develop, through this navigation, skills that are specifically and usefully middle child. The ability to read a room, to find the available space in a situation, to establish position through means other than age or adorableness. Middle children in Victorian nurseries tend to be the most diplomatically sophisticated and the most creative in the interpretation of rules that technically apply to them, but that, with the right approach, can sometimes be argued to apply slightly differently than their strict reading suggests. The currency of the sibling economy is various and context-dependent. Sweets are the most straightforward form. If you have a sweet and your sibling wants it, you have leverage. If your sibling has information about something you did that you would prefer the adults not to know, they have leverage. If you have access to the toy that the other person wants to play with, or the spot by the fire, or the side of the bed that is furthest from the window, these things all have value that can be exchanged, traded, negotiated, or simply seized unilaterally in the absence of parental supervision. Alliances form according to the logic of immediate circumstances rather than permanent affiliation. You and the sibling you were openly feuding with yesterday about the allocation of the building blocks will, when faced with the collective threat of something unpleasant, the arrival of particularly dull relatives, the imposition of an especially long lesson period, the appearance of the dreaded cod liver oil, form an alliance of impressive cohesion and joint operational effectiveness. The moment the threat passes, the alliance dissolves and the previous territorial arrangements reassert themselves, until the next external challenge requires another coalition. Secrets are the most powerful commodity of all. In a household governed by adults who expect to know everything that goes on within it, information that the adults do not have is enormously valuable. If you know something your sibling doesn't want the adults to know, you have power over them. If your sibling knows something equivalent about you, you have achieved mutual deterrence of the kind that keeps great powers from going to war. The cost of using the weapon is too high because the retaliation would be equally devastating. This system of mutual secrets produces a kind of equilibrium that is one of the more functional aspects of the Victorian sibling relationship. You do not expose each other to the adults, not because you have no desire to, but because the consequences of doing so are clear, immediate, and reciprocal. You keep the secrets. The secrets keep the peace. The peace allows a kind of freedom within the nursery that the official rules of the household do not technically permit, but that everyone, including Nanny, understands to be part of how children manage to stay sane within a system that leaves very little space for actual selfhood. At night, when the day's hostilities have been formally concluded by the arrival of bedtime, the nursery becomes something else. The darkness and the covers and the distance from adult supervision create a space in which the sibling relationship shows a different face. Whispered conversations in the dark cover ground that daytime interactions do not. Plans are made. Stories are told. Things that could not be said in the light are said in the dark, with the safety of not having to look at anyone's face while saying them. These are the conversations that will, in later years, be the most clearly remembered. Part 13. Victorian Parenting Advice: Confident, Categorical, and Often Wrong. The Victorian era produced a very large amount of advice about how to raise children, and it produced it with a confidence that was directly proportional to how wrong some of it was, which is something that seems to be a consistent feature of parenting advice across all centuries. The advice came from many sources, from doctors, from religious authorities, from domestic science writers, from other mothers, from grandmothers, from aunts, from neighbors who had read something in the latest magazine and were very keen to share it, and from the long oral tradition of household knowledge that moved from one generation to the next with the accumulated authority of age. Much of this advice is, by modern standards, startling. A significant portion of it is also, in the way of all parenting advice across history, well-intentioned, wrong in the specific details but right in the general aspiration. Which is to say, it was produced by people who genuinely wanted the children in their care to thrive, and who used the knowledge available to them to pursue that goal, even when the knowledge in question was based on a mixture of folk tradition, selective observation, and confident professional opinion, unchecked by anything resembling a controlled experiment. The advice about reading is a particularly rich area. Victorian parents and physicians were very concerned about reading, specifically about the possible negative consequences of reading too much, too fast, in the wrong light, in the wrong position, on the wrong subjects, and at the wrong times. Reading in dim light will damage your eyes. Reading novels will compromise your moral character by introducing you to situations and emotional states that you are not yet equipped to process. Reading while lying down is undignified and possibly physically dangerous. Reading too quickly is a sign of superficiality. Reading too slowly is a sign of something else. Reading before bed will excite the mind in ways that interfere with healthy sleep. Reading is simultaneously one of the best things you can do and one of the most fraught activities in the Victorian domestic repertoire, hedged around with so many qualifications and conditions that the safest reading is no reading, which is, of course, not what anyone actually means. The advice about fresh air is comprehensive and contradictory. Fresh air is essential for children. Children must have fresh air. The nursery must be aired regularly. Children must go outside. But also, children must not go outside in damp weather because damp air causes illness. Children must not go outside in very cold weather because cold air causes illness. Children must not be outside in the late evening because the evening air is particularly dangerous in ways that differ from the daytime air but are equally serious. Children who are unwell must not be outside. Children who are not unwell must be outside, but carefully. The fruit pit advice, mentioned in passing by every Victorian parent who has ever stood between a child and an apple core, deserves special treatment. The belief that swallowing a fruit pit will result in the germination of a plant in the child's stomach is not, strictly speaking, a Victorian invention, but it finds in the Victorian era an audience that deploys it with unusual frequency and conviction. You are warned about cherry stones and apple pips, and the seeds of various other fruits with a regularity that suggests your parents believe you are regularly encountering these dangers, and that only the continued provision of this warning stands between you and an internal garden. The warning works not because you believe it exactly, but because the force with which it is delivered suggests that at least one person in the chain of people who have passed this piece of advice from one generation to the next experienced something sufficiently alarming to make the warning seem proportionate. The advice about posture is relentless. Stand straight, sit straight, do not slouch, do not round your shoulders, do not tuck your chin. Walk with your head up and your back straight and your shoulders back, as though at any moment someone might want to assess the quality of your bearing and find it adequate. The consequence of bad posture, according to Victorian parenting advice, are various and serious. Illness resulting from compressed internal organs, social judgment resulting from the impression of weakness or laziness, and a general moral failing that manifests in poor posture the way other vices manifest in other physical symptoms. Good posture is both literally healthy and metaphorically virtuous. Slouching is, in some sense, a character flaw made visible. The advice about emotions is perhaps the most culturally revealing. Victorian parenting advice about emotions is consistent across sources and consistent in a direction that later eras will come to question comprehensively. Children should not indulge their feelings. Children who feel things strongly should learn to manage those feelings privately. Children who cry should be offered the opportunity to stop crying through an act of will. Children who are angry should be offered the same opportunity. The expression of strong feeling in a child is not to be encouraged, because the expression of strong feeling is what happens when self-discipline has not yet been adequately established, and self-discipline is what the entire project is about. Part 14. The Hazardous Home Arsenic Lead and the Furniture of Doom. The Victorian nursery is, to put this as carefully and as accurately as possible, decorated with things that will, in the fullness of time, be understood to have been actively bad for the people living in them. This is not something the Victorian household does on purpose. Nobody is sitting in a study somewhere, selecting wallpaper colors specifically because they are toxic. The toxicity is incidental to the decor. It comes with the available materials and the available dyes and the available manufacturing processes of an era that does not yet have the scientific tools to see what its products are actually made of, or the regulatory frameworks to care if they did. The wallpaper is the most famous example, partly because it is the most vivid and partly because the specific color associated with it, a deep, beautiful, fashionable green, is so far from what we would associate with danger that it seems almost designed to illustrate the point. Shields green and Paris green are the names most commonly attached to this category of wallpaper dye, and they are named this way because naming things after cities and scientists made them sound serious and European, and therefore desirable. They were made with copper arsenite, which is a form of arsenic, and they were used widely in wallpaper, in fabric dyes, in paint, and in various other domestic applications because they produced a green of exceptional vibrancy and staying power, and because the Victorian era did not yet know that arsenic, in the right circumstances, could turn into a gas. The circumstances that turned arsenic-dyed wallpaper into airborne arsenic involved damp. Victorian houses were damp. There was no central heating in the modern sense. There was damp in the walls. There was damp in the fabric of the building. There were molds in damp wallpaper, and when these molds consumed the arsenic in the dye, the byproduct could be a gaseous arsenic compound, and the effect of this compound on people sleeping in the room was not good. There were unexplained illnesses. There were unusual symptoms. The connection was not understood for a very long time, partly because the illnesses were attributed to other things, and partly because the idea that your wallpaper was trying to harm you was not a framework available to most Victorian households. The paint in the nursery, used on the furniture and the woodwork and the various surfaces that require periodic refreshment, is lead-based. Lead-based paint produces colors of excellent quality. It is durable. It adheres well. It dries smoothly. It has been used in buildings for centuries, and the accumulated evidence that it is not good for children who chew on the painted surfaces, or for anyone who spends significant time in enclosed spaces with paint that is in the process of flacking, has not yet reached the point of policy. Children in Victorian nurseries play with painted toys. They chew on painted toys. They breathe the air in painted rooms. They touch the painted walls and then touch their faces. This is childhood, and the lead is there. The soft furnishings contain their own contributions. Mercury was used in the production of various fabric dyes and in some felt processes. Formaldehyde was used in various preservation and treatment processes for fabrics. Camphor, present in many of the preparations used to protect clothing from moths and to generally discourage various domestic pests from taking up residence in the textiles, has effects that, in concentrated indoor environments, are not entirely benign. The coal fire that heats the room, when it heats it at all, produces combustion products. The gas lamps, when the household uses gas lamps, produce combustion products. The general quality of the air in an enclosed Victorian room in a Victorian city, in which the air quality standards of the industrial era operate at full capacity outside the window, and the combustion products of the interior's heating and lighting systems, combined with whatever the materials of the room itself are off-gassing, is not, by modern standards, an air quality that anyone would voluntarily choose. And yet, as with everything in the Victorian nursery, the people in it survive. They survive the wallpaper and the paint and the gas lamps and the coal fire and the mercury dyes and the arsenic curtains. They survive it because the doses are chronic rather than acute, because children's exposure varies, because some households are damper than others and some wallpapers are more heavily loaded than others, and because the human body has adaptive capacities that Victorian medicine both knew about and mythologized under the heading of robust constitutions. The Victorian child who grows up in the nursery is not growing up in safety, exactly. But they are growing up in the specific danger that their era provides, and they are adapting to it in the way that people in all eras adapt to the specific dangers of their particular moment. You will be fine. This is what you are told, and you will be, broadly speaking, fine. Just cough a little, avoid touching the wallpaper with your lips, and try not to notice when the curtains smell particularly strong. Part 15. Diet fads and Food Fashions, when your breakfast is an ideology. Victorian England is the birthplace of the diet fad, not in the sense that people before the Victorian era did not have opinions about food and health, but in the sense that the Victorian era produced, for the first time, a mass media context in which dietary opinions could be disseminated to a reading public at scale, endorsed by credentialed professionals, and adopted by households across the country within a single season. The result is a domestic food landscape in which what you eat for breakfast is not simply a practical matter, but an ideological one, and in which the family cook faces a constant stream of instructions derived from the latest opinions in publications that your parents trust implicitly, and that sometimes contradict each other comprehensively. The foundational principle of Victorian dietary thinking is that food is medicine. This is not a new idea, but the Victorian era gives it a new framework. The developing science of nutrition, in its very early stages, is producing people who are confident that they know which foods do which things to the body, and their confidence outpaces their evidence. Specific foods are identified as building health, promoting digestion, supporting the nerves, calming the temper, strengthening the blood, and doing various other things to the body's systems that turn out, on later inspection, to be either partly right in ways the original theory didn't quite capture or confidently wrong in ways that are instructive about the relationship between certainty and knowledge. For children specifically, Victorian dietary opinion tends in one of several directions. One direction holds that children need simple, plain food that does not overtax the digestive system or stimulate the appetite in ways that might lead to excess. The food for children who are following this school of thought is the food you have already encountered: porridge, plain bread, boiled vegetables, simple proteins without the complications of rich sauces or complex preparations. The food is not supposed to be interesting. Interest in food is, in this framework, the beginning of a slope that leads to gluttony, which is one of the 7 deadly sins and also, apparently, quite bad for the digestion. Another direction holds that children need building foods. Foods with substance. Foods that will produce the physical robustness required by the Victorian ideal of healthy childhood. This is the school that recommends beef tea, which is what happens when you simmer beef in water for a very long time and strain it, producing a liquid that tastes strongly of beef and contains some nutritional benefit, but that you, as a child, receive with the enthusiasm of someone who was hopping for actual beef rather than the idea of beef in liquid form. This school also recommends bone broth and bread pudding and various preparations involving the parts of animals that later centuries will become selective about. The patent foods are a third element, the commercial health foods of the Victorian era, sold by manufacturers who understand that parents who are anxious about their children's health represent a market, and that naming your product after either a concept of health or a professional-sounding inventor will make it more appealing. Arrowroot preparations, malted milk powders, digestive biscuits, which are called this because they are claimed to aid digestion rather than because later centuries will eat them with cheese and no particular health intention. Cod liver oil, which actually does contain useful nutrients in the form of fat-soluble vitamins, but which achieves this benefit at a significant cost in terms of flavor, and the willingness of the child consuming it to have any further interaction with spoons for the rest of the morning. The diet fad of the moment, whatever it happens to be this particular season, arrives in the household via your mother's reading material and is implemented with whatever degree of thoroughness your household's resources and your mother's commitment permit. You have eaten nothing but boiled vegetables for a week because of a doctor's article in the penny papers. You have been given beef tea every day for a month because someone's correspondent recommended it for general fortification. You have endured a period during which the family cook, under instructions from on high, attempted to incorporate some variety of grain preparation that is described in the relevant article as highly nourishing and beneficial, but that turns out, in practice, to be related to porridge in the way that cousins are related, recognizably similar in character and similarly disappointing. The food that survives all of this, the food that appears on your table regardless of the current dietary fashion, is the food of the Victorian kitchen at its most basic. The bread, the potatoes, the boiled or roasted meat on Sundays, the stewed vegetables, the jam in the pantry that you are working your way toward by good behavior, the occasional apple, the cup of tea that appears at regular intervals because tea is the one Victorian constant, the anchoring substance of the domestic day, the thing that happens before important conversations and after difficult ones and whenever something needs to happen and there is no more specific occasion. Part 16. Christmas Joy Protocol and the Ceremonial Orange. Christmas in the Victorian household is not the relaxed, sprawling, several days of consumption affair that later centuries will develop from its foundations. It is a single day of high ceremony, warm feeling, precise protocol, and emotions that are so carefully managed on their way to being expressed that they sometimes arrive already slightly compressed, emerging as a formality around a feeling rather than the feeling itself. It is wonderful. It is exhausting. It is a production that begins weeks in advance and ends in a pleasant fog of orange peel and brandy fumes, and the specific tiredness of people who have been performing the best possible version of themselves for an extended duration. The tree is the first drama. Victoria and Albert imported the Christmas tree tradition from Germany and made it fashionable, and by the middle of the era it has spread from the palace outward through the social hierarchy, with the speed of things that are both pleasant and capable of being displayed. Your family's tree is real, fragrant, and slightly treacherous, because real pine trees in an era of open flames and candle-lit rooms are a combination that the future will look back on with the alarm that it deserves, and that the era itself addressed through the technology of vigilance rather than prevention. There is always someone watching the candles. There is always a bucket of sand nearby, discreetly positioned. Not close enough to disturb the aesthetic, but close enough to be useful in the event of something that starts small and needs to be addressed quickly. The decorating of the tree involves everyone in the household at various levels of authority. The adults make decisions about placement and balance. The children are employed in the carrying of ornaments from their wrapping to the people who will place them, and in the expression of appropriate delight at each one, which is required regardless of the actual aesthetic qualities of the ornament in question. The ornaments are glass, primarily hand-blown and fragile, representing a significant financial investment that makes your mother's expression when you are near them a specific combination of warm and very watchful. Each ornament that survives from one year to the next carries with it a small piece of family history, and each one that doesn't survives as a story in the family's oral tradition. The year that was lost, the shelf that it fell from, the child who was nearby but absolutely swears they didn't touch it. Christmas morning begins early, with the cold, the noise, and the specific electric quality of a day that everyone has been looking forward to long enough that it has accumulated a significant charge of expectation. The stocking, hung the night before with more hope than certainty, is the first investigation. The stocking contains small things, perhaps a penny, perhaps a piece of candy, perhaps a small toy of the wooden variety, perhaps nuts, perhaps the orange that is the stocking's signature contribution to the Christmas morning experience. The orange, which is imported and therefore expensive and therefore not available any other time of year, is received with a genuine joy that is both about the orange and about everything the orange represents. Abundance, celebration, the permission to have something special simply because the day is special, and not because anything in particular has been earned. The gifts proper are modest by any standard that later centuries would recognize. A single significant toy for each child, if the household is prosperous enough. A piece of clothing, a book, something useful that is wrapped and given with the formality of a gift rather than simply provided as a matter of course. A game, perhaps, something for the family to do together that provides structure for the hours of the afternoon when the business of eating has concluded, and the evening is still several hours away. Christmas dinner is the centerpiece and the peak. The table is set with everything the household has that is best, laid out with a care that the daily table does not usually receive. There is meat, and there are potatoes, and there are vegetables that have been prepared with more effort than the usual boiling allows, and there is sauce, and there is bread, and there is wine for the adults in the quantities that the adults feel appropriate, and there is a particular serious quality to the serving that reflects the investment in time and money and planning that the meal represents. The pudding arrives at the end with fire on it, which is one of the most specifically Victorian moments of the year. The pudding is doused in something flammable and set alight, and it comes to the table burning blue with a light that is both genuinely impressive and slightly startling even on the 10th year of seeing it, because fire on food remains a remarkable thing regardless of how many times you have witnessed it. The family applauds. The adults feel satisfied with the production of this. The children feel the specific triumph of being present at something that adults have engineered specifically for the pleasure of witnessing it. After dinner, there are games. Victorian Christmas games are parlor games, which means they are conducted in the parlor with everyone together, with the structure of rules that prevent them from becoming chaos, and with whatever level of competitive feeling the participants bring to a game that is nominally just for fun. There is laughter, which is permitted more freely on Christmas than on other days. There are accidental revelations, things said in the heat of a game that would not normally be said, that are either laughed off or held quietly for later consideration depending on their content. There is the singing, which happens at some point in the evening, gathered around the piano if there is one, with the carol book open, and everyone singing at least some of the same words with at least approximately the same timing, which is as good as Christmas singing usually gets. Part 17. Pets and Pets. The animals you chose and the ONES that chose you. The Victorian household contains animals. Some of these animals are there by invitation. A dog, perhaps, or a cat, or a canary in a cage by the window, or in households where someone has a particular philosophical commitment to natural history, something more exotic and correspondingly more inconvenient. Some of these animals are there without invitation, as the natural consequence of living in a Victorian building, with Victorian insulation standards and Victorian food storage practices. Mice, rats, cockroaches, various species of insect, and the colonies of creatures that take up residence in the fabric of buildings, and in the fabrics of people that the Victorian era is neither equipped nor particularly organized to prevent. The invited animals occupy a specific and reasonably well-defined role. The dog is family. The dog is named, fed, spoken to, integrated into the daily schedule of the household with a naturalness that says something important about the Victorian relationship between people and their domesticated animals. Dogs in Victorian households are not accessories or status symbols in the way that later eras sometimes treat them. They are members of the household who have roles: companionship, security, the management of rodents in the case of certain terrier types, and the provision of unconditional enthusiasm that is not widely available from other members of the household during working hours. The dog's relationship with you, specifically, is one of the better relationships in your Victorian childhood. The dog does not ask you to sit still. The dog does not care about your posture or your penmanship or the quality of your Latin declensions. The dog is delighted to see you at any time of day, with an intensity that makes every arrival feel significant, and this is not nothing in a household where significance is generally reserved for formal occasions. The dog is warm and smells like dog, and sits beside you when you are quiet and follows you when you move and provides a physical companionship that costs nothing and requires nothing except that you exist in its vicinity. The canary is a different kind of animal experience. The canary is beautiful and melodic and present in its cage on the windowsill. And your relationship with it is more observational than tactile. You watch it. You listen to it. You occasionally put your finger near the bars of its cage, which is allowed, provided you do so gently and with sufficient respect. The canary's song fills the nursery on the mornings when its mood is good, and on the mornings when its mood is less good, it produces sounds that suggest it has opinions about the current quality of its seed provision. The uninvited animals are a separate matter entirely. The mice are an annual challenge, addressed with varying degrees of success by a combination of traps, cats, and the stoic acceptance that this is what living in a Victorian building involves. The insects are managed with whatever the current state of domestic pest control practice considers appropriate, which involves various preparations and sachets and strategic deployments of substances that smell strongly and are claimed to work definitively, and that work, in practice, partially and for limited periods. The bedbugs, which are a fixture of Victorian bedding that no level of social standing entirely eliminates, are addressed in the way that things are addressed when they are too unpleasant to acknowledge openly, but too present to pretend away, through the regular application of treatments that are part of the household routine without being discussed. The creatures that occupy the most intimate relationship with Victorian children are the ones that live in their hair, which is to say the lice. Lice in Victorian England are not unusual, not shameful in the way that later sensibilities will make them, not associated with any particular level of poverty or inadequacy. They are a fact of life that is managed on bath night with a specific comb and a specific preparation, and the resigned competence of someone who has done this many times before and expects to do it many times again. Nanny's special comb is one of the most consistently deployed tools in her domestic arsenal, and its use on bath night is conducted with the same brisk efficiency as the other elements of the bath, without drama, without commentary beyond the functional minimum. In this domestic ecosystem of invited and uninvited animals, Victorian children learn something that later generations have had to learn from different sources: that life is shared, that the boundary between inside and outside is not as solid as you might prefer, and that coexistence with the non-human world is not optional, but is simply the condition of being alive and inhabiting a building and eating food and having a body. This is, depending on how you look at it, either a humble and accurate way to understand one's position in the natural world, or a slightly alarming aspect of Victorian domestic life. It is possible that it is both. Part 18. GAMES and play, class, creativity, and the very specific rules of fun. Play in the Victorian era is not a simple thing. It is not the uncomplicated, unstructured, follow the child's lead affair that later child development thinking will arrive at after considerable research. It is governed by ideas about what play is for, who it is appropriate for, what forms it should take, and how it should be supervised. And these ideas are as class stratified as every other aspect of Victorian life, which means that the play of a child in a prosperous household is as different from the play of a child in a poor one as their food, their housing, their education, and their futures. In the wealthier household, play has equipment. There are rocking horses and dollhouses and board games and hoops and balls and sets of lead soldiers and construction toys of various ingenuities. Play has a room, the nursery, or a dedicated playroom in the larger houses, a space that exists specifically for the purpose of children being in it and doing child things, within limits. Play has an audience, Nanny, who is always present, always aware of what is happening, and always available to correct it if it exceeds the approved boundaries of what play should look like. The approved play is educational. This is the first criterion. Whatever you are doing with your time in the playroom, it should be possible to describe it in terms of what it is teaching you. The geography puzzle teaches geography. The spelling game teaches spelling. The building blocks teach spatial reasoning and structural principles. Even the dollhouse, which might seem to be simply a small house full of small furniture that small people can arrange, is educational in the sense that it teaches domestic management, the organization of a household, the correct arrangement of rooms and objects within them, which is the kind of knowledge that a Victorian child in a prosperous family is expected to develop. The play is also supervised in a way that directly manages its own enthusiasm. If things become too loud, they are moderated. If things become too physically energetic, they are redirected towards something with less velocity. The approved indoor games are gentle ones: card games with simple rules, word games, quiet games of make-believe that involve voices rather than running. Outdoor games have more latitude for physical expression, but outdoor games are also supervised and take place within approved areas and within approved time periods, rather than the unbounded freedom that the concept of outdoor play might suggest. For children in less prosperous circumstances, the play is both simpler and, paradoxically, wider. The street is the playroom. The materials for play are whatever the street provides: sticks, stones, bits of rope, the occasional coin for games of chance or skill, the cooperation of other street children who are also at liberty in the way that Victorian children of the working classes are at liberty when they are not working or minding younger siblings or carrying out household tasks, which is less liberty than it sounds, but more than their wealthier counterparts' supervised and approved indoor recreation. Street games have their own taxonomy: games of chase, games of strength, games involving the aim and accuracy of throwing things at other things, games whose rules are oral and variable, updated and disputed in real time by the children playing them. Marbles is universal. Hopscotch is universal. A hoop and a stick to roll it with is both a toy and a means of locomotion. Skipping rope generates its own entire subgenre of accompaniment, the rhymes chanted while the rope turns, some innocent, some not, all transmitted from older children to younger ones as part of the oral inheritance of working-class childhood. The games cross class lines in interesting ways. Some games appear in both wealthy nurseries and poor streets, modified by the available materials and the available supervision, but recognizable as variations on the same underlying activity. Marbles, played with glass in the nursery and with clay or bread in the street. Tag, played within the approved perimeters of a garden or a playground, played without perimeters in the street. Dolls, dressed in silk in the nursery, made of rags or corn husks, or whatever is available in a household that cannot afford porcelain faces and glass eyes. What the games share, regardless of class, is the quality of being done with full attention. Victorian children at play are, within the spaces their circumstances create for it, completely present in the play. There are no competing sources of stimulation. The play is what is happening, and it is what is happening completely, and this quality of focused presence that is simply the absence of distraction is, in later centuries, something that people deliberately pursue as an aspiration and can never quite recover. Part 19. The Street, a guided tour of hazards and wonders. The street outside the Victorian house is one of the great environments of the era. Densely packed, intensely stimulating, full of things that are interesting and things that are dangerous and things that are both simultaneously, governed by rules that are partly official and partly the organic social customs of people who spend a lot of time in close proximity to each other, and have worked out, through trial and error, what makes this bearable. You are not, as a rule, allowed in the street unsupervised. This is a rule that exists in most Victorian households regardless of class, though its enforcement varies significantly with circumstance. In the wealthier households, the rule is strictly maintained and backed by the presence of adults whose job it is to enforce it. You do not go into the street alone. You go into the street with Nanny, or with your mother, or with a servant charged with your supervision, and you go along approved routes and you do not stray from them, and you come back when the agreed time is concluded. In households where supervision is less available, because the adults are working and the older children are also working or minding younger ones, and there is simply no one available to perform the role of supervised excursion accompanist, children spend more time in the street under their own authority and their own judgment, which develops accordingly. A child who has spent years navigating a Victorian city street on their own judgment is a different kind of child from one who has been escorted everywhere, and not necessarily a less competent one. The street itself is a different kind of loud than anything indoors. The traffic in the Victorian street is horse-drawn, and horses are large animals that make large sounds and produce large effects on the surfaces they walk on and the atmosphere around them. The sound of a Victorian street is the sound of hooves on cobblestones, the creak and rattle of wheels, the calls of drivers and vendors and street workers and children, all overlapping without any of the acoustic structure that later centuries will organize their outdoor spaces to achieve. The vendors alone are an education. They sell things from carts, from baskets, from fixed stalls, from the kind of portable apparatus that allows a person to carry an entire commercial enterprise on their person. They sell food, pies and pastries and roasted chestnuts in winter and various preparations of fish and vegetables and things that have been turned into other things by the application of heat and seasoning. They sell household goods. They sell information in the form of newspapers and broadsheets shouted from corners. They sell entertainment in the form of musicians and puppeteers and street performers, whose acts vary from the genuinely skilled to the enthusiastically ambitious. The chimney sweeps are the figures of Victorian street life that most clearly illustrate the era's relationship between children and labor. The sweep's small assistants, the climbing boys, are children who go into chimneys professionally, up into the dark, narrow, sooty passages above the fireplace, using their small bodies to clean surfaces that no tool can reach as effectively as a child. The climbing boys are dirty and small and quick, with the particular alertness of people whose working environment requires constant attention to where their body is in space. They are not, by any measure, having a comfortable childhood, but they are, in the specific way of children who do things that require skill and courage, proud of what they do, and the pride is real even when everything surrounding it is not. You are told not to speak to them. You do anyway sometimes in the quick exchanges that happen at the edge of adult awareness, the moment of shared recognition between children of very different circumstances who are both navigating the same city from very different positions within it. Part 20. Growing Up Education Divided by Gender. At some point in your Victorian childhood, the parallel tracks on which boys and girls have been traveling, mostly in the same nursery, subject to the same gray porridge and the same nanny and the same code of silence, begin to diverge in ways that are explicit, formal, and revelatory about what the Victorian era believes each gender is for. For boys, the divergence involves an escalation, preparation for the world that is waiting, the world of professions and commerce and public life, requires a kind of education that the nursery cannot provide, and this education is obtained through the school system, the boarding school system for those with the resources, the day school system for those without. The boy who goes away to school is going somewhere harder than the nursery, somewhere with its own hierarchies and its own codes and its own forms of discipline, somewhere that will spend years making him into the kind of man the Victorian era needs. The curriculum for boys, as described in the schoolroom section, is classical, mathematical, physical, and moral. It is classical because Latin and Greek represent the intellectual heritage of Western civilization, and a gentleman must have access to them. It is mathematical because mathematics is the language of commerce and engineering, and the disciplines that are building the empire. It is physical because physical robustness is considered a moral virtue as well as a practical asset, and cricket and rugby and the other outdoor sports of the boarding school are as much character building as they are athletic. And it is moral because the entire enterprise of Victorian education, at whatever level it operates, is fundamentally about producing people of good character, and character is considered the product of a sufficiently demanding formation. For girls, the divergence involves a redirection, not necessarily a reduction, though later critics will frame it that way, but a redirection toward a different set of competencies and a different sphere of operation. The Victorian girl's education is designed to prepare her for the household, for society, for marriage, and for the management of a domestic establishment that will require skills of organization, social intelligence, aesthetic judgment, and the kind of gracious authority that a well-run Victorian home requires. The finishing school, or the governess-managed equivalent of it in households that cannot afford the institutional version, covers music, drawing, languages primarily French for the social utility of it, needlework, household management principles, the correct forms of address for various social situations, and the art of conversation conducted within the limits of what women in this era are expected to produce in mixed company, which is to say pleasant, informed, uncontroversial, and never threatening to anyone who might be listening. The emotional requirements of this education are different for boys and girls in ways that reflect the era's gender constructions. Boys must not cry. Boys must develop the stoic capacity to endure discomfort without public display, because public display of feeling is considered feminine and therefore, in the logic of Victorian gender construction, inappropriate in a masculine context. Girls may display feeling within limits, particularly the feelings associated with sensitivity, tenderness, and sentiment, which are coded as feminine virtues. But they may not display the feelings that suggest autonomy or strength, or the kind of self-determined passion that the era's domestic ideology has no role for women to occupy. Both these programs, taken together, produce adults who are proficient in performing the required version of their gender, and who may or may not have found, in the margins of this performance, room for whatever they actually are. The Victorian era is full of people who managed this margin. Boys who became poets, who cried in private, who found in the approved curriculum a door that led to something the curriculum hadn't intended. Girls who read everything they were told not to read, who found in the restricted range of their approved subjects a technique for looking at the approved subjects in ways the approvers hadn't anticipated. The constraints produce, as constraints sometimes do, people of unusual creativity and resolution, shaped by the specific pressure of an era that didn't quite contain what was inside them. Part 21. Teething, the first ordeal and everything used to address it. The arrival of teeth in the Victorian infant is treated with the seriousness of an event for which preparations must be made, responses must be ready, and no possibility of solution should be ruled out before it has been tried. This is not unreasonable, since teething genuinely is unpleasant for the infant experiencing it, and the people living with the infant experiencing it. But the Victorian era's response to teething is shaped by the same qualities that shape its response to everything else: genuine care, limited knowledge, enormous confidence, and a medicine chest full of things that work faster than they should, and for reasons that no one is quite ready to look at too closely. The earliest response, the instinctive response, the response that everyone in the household agrees on regardless of their opinions about everything else, is the bread crust. The hard, dry, slightly stale bread crust has been recommended for teething infants across centuries, and the recommendation survives into the Victorian era because it is at least partly right. Something for the gums to work against does provide some relief, and the bread crust is available, free, and harmless. The bread crust is the starting point. From the bread crust, the escalation proceeds through several stages. The next stage is usually something cold, a cooled teething ring, a piece of frozen cloth, something that uses temperature to address the inflammation in the way that later generations will also recommend, for the same reason that it actually helps somewhat. The teething ring is made of whatever the household's resources provide, which might be bone, ivory, silver, or in less prosperous households, whatever shaped, smooth, cool material can be pressed into service. If the cooled teething ring is insufficient, which it frequently is at 3 in the morning when the infant has been expressing its dissatisfaction with the situation for what feels like a geological period, the Victorian household escalates to spirits. Alcohol applied to the gums produces a numbing effect that gives temporary relief, and the temporary relief is better than no relief, and the quantity involved is small enough to not immediately cause concern to anyone who has not thought too carefully about what they are applying to an infant's mucous membranes and why it works. Brandy is the most commonly cited spirit for this purpose. It is applied on a finger or a cloth. The infant usually accepts it, because infants are generally willing to accept something that relieves the discomfort, and the brandy relieves it. The medicine options, when the spirits don't suffice, bring us back to Mrs. Winslow's soothing syrup, which we have discussed, and to its cousins and competitors. The various other proprietary preparations for infant distress that the Victorian market has produced in quantities proportional to the demand for them, which is enormous. Each of these products has a name that suggests professionalism and care: Dr. Something Something Remedy, or Mrs. Somebody's Special Preparation for Infants, or the original and genuine Something Cordial. Each of these products contains, in varying proportions, the substances that make them work, which are the substances that make any good Victorian infant medicine work: opiates, alcohol, and optimism. You, the child who is teething, experience this sequence from the inside, which means you experience the discomfort and then something happens, and the discomfort becomes less acute, and then you sleep. The sleeping is the thing your parents are grateful for. The sleeping means the night has become manageable. The sleeping means tomorrow is possible. The questions about what exactly produce the sleeping, about what the syrup contains and what it does to an infant's nervous system, and what the long-term effects might be, are questions that the era does not yet have the tools to ask, and so they are not asked, and the sleeping is simply the sleeping, and it is enough. The teeth arrive eventually, as teeth do, regardless of everything that has been applied and chewed and administered in the process of getting them there. They emerge from the gums with a predictability that contrasts instructively with the drama surrounding their arrival. One day there is no tooth. Some days later there is a tooth. The family notes its appearance with the relief and satisfaction of people who have survived something together and arrived, intact, on the other side. Part 22. Nature WALKS, fresh air, SUPERVISED and suspicious. The Victorian household believes in outdoor exercise for children. This belief is consistent, earnest, and expressed in regular mandatory excursions into whatever outdoor environment is available, conducted according to rules that are no less extensive for being applied to the open countryside rather than the nursery. The nature walk is not a loose, exploratory, follow-your-nose experience of the natural world. It is an organized, purposeful, adults-present, children-supervised outing in which the benefits of fresh air and natural observation are obtained within a structure that prevents anything too interesting from happening. You are dressed for the nature walk in what the Victorian household considers appropriate outdoor clothing, which is to say more of everything, more layers than the temperature strictly requires. A hat, gloves, even when the temperature of the day does not mandate gloves, because gloves are for outdoors and you are going outdoors. Sturdy boots that have been polished not for the walk, but because polished boots are polished boots, and the state of your boots reflects on the family in outdoor contexts, just as it does in indoor ones. You are dressed as though the nature walk might involve presenting yourself to someone important, which in a way it does, since you might encounter someone the family knows, or someone who might know someone the family knows, and your appearance is always evidence for or against the quality of your upbringing. The walk proceeds at a pace calibrated by the slowest adult, which is also calibrated by the most conservative adult, because the pace of a Victorian nature walk is one that allows for proper observation and does not encourage the kind of physical exertion that produces flushed cheeks outside of an acceptable range or inappropriate perspiration. You walk. You observe things at a distance consistent with the rules about touching natural objects, which include not touching most of them. The plants might be poisonous. The animals might bite. The ground beyond the path might harbor structural unreliability beneath its pleasant surface. The puddles are forbidden for reasons that have been explained sufficiently many times that you no longer need them repeated. What you are allowed to do is look. You can look at things. You can make observations about them within the vocabulary of natural history that has been provided to you through your lessons, which means you can identify species by their proper names and describe their characteristics in the language of natural science rather than the language of enthusiasm, which is considered less intellectually rigorous. A bird is not beautiful. A bird is a member of a particular species with particular features and habits that can be described. Describing it accurately is the approved mode of appreciation. The wild things that you want to do, the things that the natural environment seems to be specifically designed to invite, the climbing and the running and the reaching into hedgerows for whatever lives there, and the lying flat on the ground to look at things at their own level, and the shouting into the open sky just to hear what it sounds like. These things are not approved. They might be available in the very early seconds before an adult notices and reacts, in the gap between permission and prohibition that exists in every supervised childhood as the space where actual experience happens. But they are not officially sanctioned, and they are not repeated without consequences. You find your rebellions where they fit. A dandelion, pulled from the side of the path in the half-second when no one is looking, is held for the duration of the walk in the inside of your glove, a small organic secret. A stone, smooth and interesting, fits in the pocket and will be examined later at leisure. The moment when the adult supervising you is distracted by something they need to address, when your back is to them for 2 seconds and the hedge is right there, and something is rustling in it, and you put your hand in and feel whatever it is a moment you will remember with the specific clarity of experiences that cost something and were worth it. Part 23. Victorian superstitions, GHOSTSOMENS, and the well-kept soul. The Victorian era has a complicated relationship with superstition. It is the age of science, the age of Darwin and Faraday and Kelvin, the age of industrial technology and empirical investigation, and the systematic expansion of human knowledge about the natural world. It is also, simultaneously, the age of seances, of ghost stories told with absolute seriousness, of the Society for Psychical Research investigating phenomena that it treats as worthy of investigation, of a domestic culture saturated with folk beliefs about luck and ill omen, and the management of supernatural forces through the right combination of precaution and ritual. The Victorian nursery exists within this double atmosphere, and the child growing up in it absorbs both of its layers. You know about Darwin. You know about electricity. You know about the germ theory of disease, or you will know about it, because it is the current scientific excitement, and it filters into even the most domestic contexts. You also know about the specific creak that the third step from the top makes late at night when everyone is in bed and nothing should be making noise. You know about the mirror in the hallway and why it is advisable not to look into it after dark. You know about the cat's behavior in the room at the top of the stairs, which is either evidence of feline instinct or evidence of something else, depending on who you ask. The superstitions that govern the Victorian nursery have practical content mixed with their supernatural framing. Don't walk under a ladder. The danger is the thing that might fall on you, not the luck that might be disrupted, but the superstition preserves the behavior even when the physical danger is not currently present. Don't break a mirror. The object has value, and its preservation is practical even when it is framed in terms of bad luck. Knock on wood. The ritual is harmless and provides a sense of control over circumstances that are otherwise uncontrollable, which is not nothing. But some of the superstitions are purely supernatural in their content, based on beliefs about the world that have nothing to do with the physical dangers of the world, and everything to do with a cosmology in which the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable, in which certain behaviors attract misfortune in ways that cannot be traced through physical cause and effect, and in which the management of this permeable boundary requires constant low-level vigilance from everyone in the household. Salt thrown over the shoulder goes backward in time through the household's history to the era when spilling salt was an actual luxury problem, not just a bad omen. Shoes on the table are forbidden for reasons that the adults in your household can state clearly in superstitious terms, but that no one can quite explain rationally. Certain things done in certain orders attract luck. Certain arrangements of domestic objects ward things off. The first of the month, spoken at the right moment, produces good fortune. Spoken at the wrong moment, it is simply the date. The ghost stories that are told in the Victorian nursery are the most vivid element of this superstitious landscape, and they are told with a relish that suggests the Victorian child's taste for being frightened is the same as the taste for this experience in all other children in all other centuries. The stories involve specific places, specific kinds of entities, specific consequences for specific behaviors. The ghost of a previous occupant of this very house. The pale figure seen at the window of the room that no one uses. The sound that could be explained as the house settling or the pipes contracting, except that it sounds like neither of those things. The feeling in certain rooms at certain times that something is present that is not visible. You carry the superstitions with you into adulthood, in the way that things absorbed before rationalism fully develops carry forward as instincts rather than beliefs. You don't quite believe them, but you don't quite not believe them either. You knock on wood. You don't open an umbrella indoors. You pick up the salt that spills and you do something with it that you no longer remember the reasoning for. And in the darkest hours of winter nights, when the house makes its noises and the shadows move across the ceiling, you are not quite as certain as the rational daylight version of yourself that the shadows are only shadows. Part 24. Adolescence, the thing nobody entiends. Adolescence, in the Victorian household, is handled through the technique that the Victorian household applies to most uncomfortable realities. It is not directly addressed. It is observed from a careful distance by the adults around you who are aware that it is happening and who respond to its evidence by making adjustments to your schedule, your supervision, and the literature available to you, without ever connecting these adjustments to the thing that is causing them. Your body, at some point in your early teenage years, begins to do things that you were not forewarned about by anyone in your household, because forewarning would require a conversation that the Victorian domestic culture does not have the vocabulary for, or rather has the vocabulary for but has decided not to use in this context. The medical encyclopedia exists, and it contains information. The information it contains is presented in language so careful, so hedged, so wrapped in the professional gravity of a text written by someone who believes the subject matter requires containment, that extracting practical understanding from it is more work than it is worth. For boys, the experience of adolescence is managed primarily through increased physical activity and decreased indoor leisure. If you seem restless, you are sent outside. If you seem unfocused, you are given more demanding academic work. If you seem to be in a mood that does not map onto any of the approved moods of a well-managed Victorian boy, you are directed toward the cricket field or the gymnasium or some other venue where physical exertion is available as a solution to whatever problem has manifested itself in a non-physical form. The conversation you need, the one that explains in plain terms what is happening to you and why, and what it means and what you can expect next, does not happen. If it happens at all, it happens in the gaps and margins of your official formation. From an older cousin who says something not quite explicit in a moment between one thing and the next, from a friend at school who has received information from somewhere, and is now disseminating it with the excited inaccuracy of someone passing on a message they received mostly correctly, from a book that is not in the approved library, but that circulates among boys of a certain age with the speed of things that are both sought after and forbidden. For girls, the arrival of adolescence is managed through a sudden increase in female domestic supervision, a change in the content and intensity of conversations about marriage and social responsibility, and the management of one's person and one's reputation. What the conversation is actually about is not said directly. What is said directly is a series of rules about where to sit, how to move, what to avoid, what to be careful of, what to report to one's mother immediately, and what to handle with the prepared materials that are suddenly provided without being explained. The rules are clear. Their reasons are not stated. The girl who receives them is expected to deduce from the rules themselves what they are protecting against, and she generally does, but the deduction is not supplemented by any direct information about whether her deductions are correct. Both experiences produce, in the adolescents going through them, the specific Victorian coping strategy. You write things down. The diary becomes the location of what cannot be said aloud, the space where the actual experience of adolescence can be recorded in something close to its actual quality, unconditioned by the requirements of performing the approved version of yourself for an audience that has strong opinions about how you should be presenting. Victorian adolescent diaries, where they survive, are remarkable documents, formal in their language, in the way that people who have been trained to write formally write even in private, but personal in their content in a way that the official record of Victorian childhood is not. You get through it. Everyone gets through it. You emerge, slightly battered, from the unacknowledged ordeal of Victorian adolescence with a specific set of skills: the ability to manage significant personal experience without external support, the discipline to continue performing the required public self, while the private self undergoes its transformation, and a relationship with writing as a private space that some of you will never quite give up, even after you no longer need it for the same reasons. Part 25. Bedtime, the Ritual, the Draft, and the Sleeping Draft. Bedtime in the Victorian household is the end of the day's long performance. The schedule that governs every hour from Nanny's curtain opening in the morning to this final moment has led here, to the nursery in the last light, to the nightshirt and the prayers and the scratchy blanket, and the specific combination of exhaustion and restlessness that is the Victorian child's most common sleeping companion. The bedtime routine begins with washing. Not a bath, not on a non-bath night, but the ceremonial washing of hands and face that marks the transition from the day's person to the night's person, performed with cold water from the ewer and the face cloth that lives beside it, applied with whatever degree of thoroughness Nanny considers appropriate for the cleanliness accumulated during the day in question. You stand at the washstand and you wash, and you are checked for completeness. Prayers follow. The Victorian child's bedtime prayer is not a casual conversation with the divine, but a formal recitation, performed kneeling beside the bed in the cold with hands clasped and eyes appropriately downcast, covering the day's gratitudes and the night's requests in language that has been provided and practiced, and that you can now produce on demand with the smooth fluency of anything learned by repetition before the age when you started evaluating what you were saying as you said it. The prayers address God with the same careful formality that the Victorian child addresses everyone else of superior authority, which is to say with respect, brevity, and a careful avoidance of anything that might be considered either excessively personal or insufficiently sincere. You thank God for the day. You ask for protection during the night. You mention the family members who are in need of divine attention. You conclude with the standard formulas. You rise from your knees. The bedtime story is what it is on any given night, which is variable. Some nights there is a genuine story, told by Nanny or a parent or an older sibling, with the particular quality of night storytelling that is quieter and less structured than daytime telling, more susceptible to the atmosphere of the darkened room, and the covers pulled up, and the listener already halfway toward sleep. Some nights the story is a passage from a book, read aloud in the low light of whatever is still burning in the room, something approved and suitable, and with a moral content that provides the last instruction of the day even as it provides the last narrative. Some nights there is no story at all, and you are simply told that it is time for sleep, which is true, which does not make it feel like less of a loss. The sleeping draft, when it appears, arrives with the matter-of-fact authority that Nanny brings to all medicinal interventions. It is needed because you are having difficulty sleeping, or because you have been unwell and rest is required, or because the household needs this to end, and the most reliable way of ending it is the specific contents of the brown bottle on Nanny's shelf. The draft tastes of something sweet, and something else underneath the sweet that you cannot quite identify and that you associate, because you have associated it with sleep often enough, with the feeling of the room becoming slightly less solid, the thoughts becoming slightly less sequential, the ceiling becoming something less precise in the darkness, and more a surface that things happen across until the things stop happening. You sleep. The house settles around you, the sounds of it becoming part of the texture of your sleep rather than signals requiring attention. The fire in the grate, if there is still a fire, keeps the room at whatever temperature it keeps it, and the blankets maintain whatever warmth they maintain, and the night passes in the way Victorian nights pass, full of the sounds that buildings make when left to themselves, and the weather outside, and the particular silence that is not silence but is the sound of people at rest in adjacent rooms, breathing and turning, and occasionally dreaming in ways that become audible. By morning, the night will have been successfully survived. This is the basic achievement of Victorian childhood. Survival, repeatedly accomplished, producing a person who has been through enough to know that they can get through things. The gray porridge, the cold water, the medicine chest, the lectures, the lessons, the rules, the confined play and the supervised walks and the narrow world of the nursery and the vast performance of the dinner table. All of it culminates in someone who has been thoroughly prepared for an existence that requires endurance, and who has been given, in the specific discipline of that preparation, the means to endure it. Part 26. Getting dressed, layers, LACES, and the daily costume dressing in the Victorian era is the first daily exercise in discipline, an activity that begins moments after waking and that establishes, before any other interaction with the day has occurred, the principles that will govern everything that follows: compliance, precision, patience, and the wearing of significantly more fabric than you might personally choose. The quantity of clothing that a Victorian child is required to wear is calibrated to the Victorian theory of child vulnerability, which holds that children are fundamentally susceptible to cold, damp, and drafts in ways that require preemptive protection at all times, and in all weather, because weather, in the Victorian understanding, is never so mild that the possibility of a sudden deterioration can be ruled out, and the consequences of that deterioration are too serious to risk. This theory is not incorrect exactly. Children are more vulnerable than adults in certain respects, but the theory's practical application results in a layering system that converts the act of getting dressed into an ordeal of 10 to 20 minutes minimum duration, and that produces, on warm days, a level of personal temperature that constitutes its own hazard. The layers are applied from the inside out, from the skin outward to the world, in a sequence that is invariable, and that each layer is required to be adjusted and secured before the next one goes on. The underwear layer is extensive by the standards of what will come to seem normal: chemises and drawers for girls, vests and drawers for boys, made of wool or cotton or flannel, depending on the season and the household's position on the spectrum of cold management. Over this goes the next layer, and over that the next, and each one is buttoned or tied or buckled or hooked in whatever way its construction demands, and each fastening is verified as correct before proceeding. For girls, the stays deserve particular attention because they are the item of Victorian girlhood that later accounts return to most frequently and with most emphasis. The stays are a junior version of the adult corset, designed to provide posture support and to begin, early, the shaping of the torso toward an adult silhouette that the era considers desirable. They are not, in the child's version, the extreme instruments of the adult form. They do not compress and reshape in the same degree. But they do constrain, and they do make sitting and bending and breathing at full capacity less easy than they would be in their absence. Nanny laces them from behind with the practiced efficiency of someone who has done this many times, and the result is a small body in a small garment that has a definite opinion about what positions are and are not comfortable. For boys, the equivalent experience is the collar. The Victorian boy's collar is an architectural achievement in starched fabric, upright, rigid, maintaining its form under the conditions of the school day or the social occasion, with the resolution of something that has been engineered for this specific purpose. It is attached to the shirt or worn separately depending on the collar's design, and the shirt's design and the specific sartorial convention of the household. And it sits at the throat with a closeness that is intended to look neat, and that, in practice, also discourages the full range of head movements that might, in a less collared existence, be taken for granted. The outer clothing, once the foundational layers are in place, is the clothing that is visible to the world. The dress and pinafore for girls, the trousers and jacket for boys, the whole coordinated ensemble that represents the household's answer to the question of what a properly turned-out Victorian child looks like. The answer involves no visible wrinkles. It involves shoes polished to an appropriate brightness. It involves hair arranged in whatever form is currently appropriate, For girls, this usually means braided or pinned in ways that require time and skill to execute, and a level of stillness during their execution that is challenging for a child who has just been woken up and is not yet fully committed to the day. The getting dressed is not something you do alone. Nanny is involved. Your mother is sometimes involved. The involvement of adults in the physical process of getting you dressed continues until you are deemed old enough and sufficiently competent to dress yourself, which happens at different ages in different households, but which is, whenever it happens, both a milestone of independence and a small bereavement. The morning that is no longer organized around someone else's careful attention to how you are presented to the world. A letter from the other side, and so we arrive at the end. The candle is guttering. The night beyond the window is quiet, and the Victorian city has finally given itself over to something approaching rest, and you have survived another full day in the most demanding training program that childhood ever devised. You have eaten the porridge. You have endured the collar. You have memorized what Nanny required and recited it correctly on the first attempt, or at least on the second. You have sat at the dinner table without committing any offense grave enough to be addressed, and you have made it to this room, this bed, this blanket, this particular shade of darkness, without being the subject of a lecture that ended in tears, and that is a genuine achievement, and you should feel exactly as proud of it as you do. The Victorian childhood, seen from the outside and from the distance of a century and a half, is a landscape of extraordinary contradictions. It is an era of genuine love expressed through the most indirect and qualified means imaginable. It is an era of real investment in children's well-being that produced conditions that a modern child welfare system would find alarming. It is an era of tremendous intellectual ambition applied to child rearing in ways that were sometimes right and sometimes spectacularly wrong, and that were always, completely confident. The parents who dosed their bobbies with morphine-based syrups were not bad parents. They were parents who were trying to solve the problem of a suffering infant with the best tools their era provided. The nannies who applied carbolic soap with sandpaper enthusiasm were not unkind women. They were women who believed, with every fiber of their professional training, that cleanliness was health and health was character, and character was everything. The teachers who made children memorize Latin conjugations until their hands ached were not torturing them. They were giving them, in the form they had available, access to the intellectual tradition they genuinely believed would serve them. And the children, the ones who ate the gray porridge and wore the restricting stays and sat on the hard schoolroom benches and watched the authorized quantity of sunset through the approved window, became people. They became people with particular qualities, a capacity for endurance that is not common, a relationship with discomfort that is not primarily about escaping it, a knowledge of rules that extends beyond the specific rules they were taught to the understanding of what rules are for, an appreciation learned through scarcity for the things that matter, warmth, sweetness, rest, the company of people who know your history, the moments when the schedule relaxes and the jam is available and the evening is long enough to tell stories in. They became people who knew how to be bored without it becoming a problem, because boredom in the Victorian nursery was simply an atmospheric condition like cold that you lived in rather than escaped. They knew how to be quiet without it meaning absence, because quiet in the Victorian household was not emptiness but a different kind of full. They knew how to find the available joy in whatever was actually available, rather than in the hypothetical joy of something better that wasn't. These are, as it turns out, not the worst things to know. They are the things that last. So tonight, wherever you are, lying in a bed that is not slightly damp, under a blanket that does not smell of camphor, in a room whose walls are not actively hazardous, breathing air that has not been through a horse first, with a breakfast tomorrow morning that is not going to be gray, spare a moment for the children of the Victorian nursery. They did not have it easy, and they were not told it should be easy, and they survived it anyway in the specific stubborn way of people who have been given no alternative. Sleep well. You have warm walls around you and all the jam is unlocked, and nobody is going to dose you with Mrs. Winslow's anything, and the candle is out, and the night is very quiet, and the morning will arrive when it arrives and not a moment before. And until then, there is nothing required of you at all. Good night.